The blood had gone glassy. Frederick Wensley crouched, knees cracking in the damp cold, and stared at the dark, vitreous glaze spreading across the cobbles of the narrow yard behind 119 Houndsditch. It was not merely wetness. It was a sealing, a hardening of the life that had leaked out of Constable Tucker only minutes before, turning the red slick into something brittle under the heel of a boot. The silence pressing against his eardrums felt heavier than the gunfire that had shattered the winter night, a physical weight that made the lungs work harder to draw in the sulfur-thick air. He reached out, gloved finger hovering over Tucker's still hand, then pulled back. Touching the dead now felt like an intrusion, a violation of the sudden, absolute privacy they had entered. "Frederick!" The voice came from above, rough with the strain of holding back the uniformed men crowding the alley mouth. Wensley did not look up immediately. He kept his eyes on the shattered window frame of the shop, the wood splintered outward as if the glass had exploded from the inside, calculating the angle, the height, the precise geometry of the slaughterhouse they had stumbled into. "Thompson," Wensley said, his voice low, barely carrying over the murmurs of the constables shifting their weight on the frozen ground. "Keep them back. If one more man tramples this yard, I'll have him digging grave in the rain until Easter." "The lads want to see, sir. They're saying it's the Ripper returned, or worse." "There is no ghost here, John, only men with Mausers and a lack of conscience." Wensley finally rose, his spine stiffening as the cold seeped through his wool coat. He moved to the second body, Constable Bentley, lying twisted near the coal chute. The position was wrong. The limbs were arranged in a way that suggested a frantic, failed attempt to crawl towards safety before the final shot caught him. Wensley knelt again, ignoring the protest of his old injury, and began the methodical work. He checked the pockets, not for clues he knew what they would find, but to affirm the humanity of the men beneath the uniform. A packet of woodbines, crushed. A letter from a sister in Leeds, unopened. A pocket watch, the glass face shattered, hands stopped at a time that felt too early for such finality. Nothing that explained why three good men lay cooling in the filth of a jeweler's backyard, while the killers had vanished into the fog like smoke. He stood brushing the grime from his knees and turned his gaze back to the window. The black hole of the shop interior yawned behind the broken sash, a mouth that had swallowed the light and the lives. His mind, trained by years of walking the beat in Whitecapel, tried to reconstruct the sequence. The entry, the challenge, the sudden eruption of lead. But the details slipped away, replaced by the visceral image of Tucker's blood freezing into that dark, vitreous glaze. It was a detail that stuck, ugly and specific, anchoring the horror in the physical world rather than the abstract notion of duty lost. Inside the shop, the floorboards vibrated. Fritz Svars pressed his back against the cold plaster of the wall, his chest heaving as he fought to control the rhythm of his breathing. The smell of cordite hung thick and acrid, clinging to the back of his throat, mixing with the dust of fallen lathes and the metallic tang of overturned safes. He could feel the vibration of his comrades' boots above him, scrambling over the partition wall into the next property, a frantic scuttling that echoed through the thin timber of the floor. Go, he thought, the command silent in his own head, do not look back. His hands trembled, not from fear. The fear had burned away in the first volley, but from the sheer hollow surge of survival. They had done it. They had turned the trap inside out, killed the hunters, and slipped the noose. Yet, as the sounds of the police shouting in the yard grew louder, muffled by the walls but unmistakable in their urgency, a hollowness opened up in his gut. It was not victory. It was merely a reprieve, bought with blood that would stain the cobbles for days. He gripped the revolver tighter, the metal warm from his palm, and listened to the distant wail of a city waking up to the violence he had helped unleash. There was no glory in the shaking of his hands, only the cold calculation of the next wall, the next roof, the next mile of fog-choked streets. So, Thompson was beside him now, his face pale in the gaslight that flickered from a bracket on the brickwork. The sergeant's eyes darted between the bodies and the dark window, unable to settle, haunted by the proximity of the death. "They're gone, Frederick," Thompson said, the words sounding like an admission of failure. "Over the wall, we have men circling the block, but the fog, it's thick as soup out there." They haven't left London, Wensley said, his voice hardening, the shock receding behind a wall of professional resolve. Men who shoot like that, who plan like that, they don't run to the countryside. They burrow. They find a hole in the East End and they wait. We should pursue immediately, every minutiae, and lose half the force to confusion in the mist. No, Wensley stepped closer to the brick wall, his eyes sweeping the damage. We secure the scene, we count the casings, we find out exactly what they fired and where they stood. Then we hunt them with our eyes open, not stumbling blind in the dark. He moved towards the far corner of the yard, where the brickwork was pocked with fresh scars. One particular mark caught his eye, a deep dent in the mortar just above head height. Wensley reached out, his fingernails scraping against the rough surface until it clicked against something metallic. He worked it loose, the object falling into his gloved palm with a tiny, significant weight. A spent casing, brass gleaming dull in the intermittent gaslight, the base stamped with markings that spoke of foreign manufacture. A Mauser, the tool of the trade for these new revolutionaries, distinct from the Webleys carried by his own men. He turned it over, the metal cold against his skin, a tangible promise that the hunters would follow the trail no matter how deep into the fog it led. "Bag this, John," Wensley said, handing the casing to Thompson, his eyes never leaving the dark window where the shadows seemed to shift and breathe. "And send a runner to the yard. Tell them we aren't looking for thieves anymore, we're looking for a war." The wind picked up, swirling the fog around their ankles, but Wensley stood firm, the weight of the dead men at his back and the taste of iron in his mouth, knowing that the silence of the yard was only the prelude to a much louder, fiercer storm. The brass casing sat in the brown paper envelope, a hard little seed of evidence that refused to soften against Wensley's thumb. He pressed it once, twice, feeling the ridges of the firing pin indent through the thick stock, before sliding it into the inner pocket of his coat, where it rested against the wool of his waistcoat, cold and accusing. "Runner's gone, sir," Thompson said, stepping out of the shadows near the coal chute, his cap pulled low against the drifting mist. "Young Miller, he knows the shortcut through the market, won't stop for the cabs." "Good." Wensley didn't turn. His eyes remained fixed on the shattered window, the jagged teeth of glass still clinging to the frame like broken promises. "But tell him to take the long way back if he sees anyone loitering by the fence. We don't need eyes on us just yet." Thompson shifted his weight, the leather of his boots squeaking against the wet stone, a sound that seemed obscenely loud in the hushed yard. "Loitering? At this hour? The whole block's shuttered tighter than a drum, Frederick. Even the rats have gone to ground." "The rats are exactly what I'm worried about." Wensley finally turned, his face drawn, the gaslight carving deep hollows beneath his cheekbones. These men didn't just shoot 3 constables and vanish into thin air. They needed a hole to crawl into. Someone opened it for them. He walked back towards the bodies, the crunch of his footsteps on the frozen grime marking time in a rhythm he couldn't quite control. Tucker lay nearest the wall, his uniform jacket pulled tight across the chest, where the blood had soaked through and then stiffened, turning the fabric into a shell that would crack if moved too roughly. Bentley was further out, one arm flung wide, as if reaching for a weapon that had slipped from his grasp in those final, chaotic seconds. Choate was the worst, slumped against the wheelbarrow, his face obscured by the angle of his fall, hidden from the prying eyes of the universe. Wensley crouched again, ignoring the protest of his knee, the old injury from a fall in Bethnal Green flaring up with a dull, familiar ache. He reached out, not to touch the dead, but to adjust the collar of Tucker's tunic, brushing away a flake of soot that had settled on the blue wool. It was a small, futile gesture, an attempt to impose order on a scene that had rejected all logic. "They used Mausers," Wensley murmured, more to himself than to the sergeant standing vigil behind him. "Automatic pistols, not the sort of thing a common burglar carries in his pocket while cracking a safe." "Foreign make," Thompson supplied, his voice tight. "Anarchist gear, that's the talk already circulating among the lads." "Talk is cheap, John, and often wrong." Wensley stood, brushing his hands on his trousers, leaving streaks of grey dust on the dark fabric. "But the cartridges won't lie. That casing proves they were armed for war, not robbery. No thief shoots to kill unless he's cornered, and these men, they opened fire the moment the door breached. They were waiting. A sudden clatter from the street beyond the yard wall made both men snap their heads around, hands instinctively dropping to the holsters at their hips. The sound was sharp, metallic, followed by the muffled thud of footsteps retreating quickly into the fog. "Stay," Wensley ordered, the word barely a whisper. He moved towards the gate, his steps silent now, the training of 20 years overriding the stiffness in his joints. He pushed the heavy wooden door open just a crack, peering out into the narrow alleyway that ran parallel to Houndsditch. The fog here was thicker, swirling in dense, yellow clumps that obscured the gas lamps further down the street. Nothing moved, just the shifting mist and the distant, rhythmic clomp of a horse's hooves on the main road. "Nothing," he said, closing the gate and sliding the bolt home. "Just the wind playing tricks, or perhaps a stray cat knocking over a bin." "Or a lookout," Thompson suggested, his hand still resting on his revolver, making sure the coast is clear for the others to move. "Possible." Wensley walked back to the center of the yard, the spatial geometry of the killing field reassembling itself in his mind. If they have lookouts, they have a network, and if they have a network, they have supplies, food, ammunition, a place to sleep. "They won't stay in Stepney," Thompson argued, though the conviction in his voice was thinning. "Too hot. They'll head for the docks, try to slip onto a steamer before dawn." "No," Wensley shook his head, the motion slow and deliberate. "They killed police officers, 3 of them, in their own backyard. They know the entire force will be tearing the docks apart within the hour. They won't run towards the net. They'll dig in. They'll find a house with thick walls and a clear line of sight, and they will wait for us to come to them." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The idea that men who had just executed 3 constables would choose to stand their ground rather than flee seemed madness. Yet, as Wensley looked at the frozen blood on the cobbles, at the stark violence of the shattered window, it felt less like madness and more like a grim calculation. These were not common criminals driven by greed or desperation. They were driven by something else, something ideological and rigid that valued martyrdom over survival. "We need more men," Thompson said, his breath pluming in the cold air. "And we need the heavy guns. If they're dug in, a standard cordon won't hold them." "I'll send for the divisional reserve," Wensley agreed. "But no one moves until I say so. We don't storm anything blindly, not after this." He looked down at Tucker again, the young constable's face pale and waxy in the dim light. A fly, confused by the winter chill, landed on the tip of Tucker's nose, paused, and then buzzed away into the darkness. It was a small, living thing in a place of death, an intrusion of the mundane that made Wensley's stomach turn. "Cover them," Wensley said softly. "Get some tarps from the station, proper ones, not those ragged scraps from the storehouse. They deserve dignity before the coroner arrives." "Sir," Thompson hesitated, then nodded, turning to signal the 2 uniformed officers who had been hovering nervously by the gate. "You heard the inspector. Fetch the covers, and be respectful." As the officers moved to obey, Wensley turned his back on the scene, walking towards the corner where the shadow of the building stretched longest. He leaned against the brickwork, the cold seeping through his coat, and closed his eyes for a brief moment. The image of the trembling hands inside the shop flashed in his mind again, unbidden. The shooter, the man who had pulled the trigger, he hadn't seen fear in that imagined trembling. He had seen something far more dangerous. Resolve. "Frederick," Thompson's voice cut through his reverie, closer this time. "The runner's back. Miller just arrived. He has a message from the chief." Wensley opened his eyes, the moment of weakness sealed away behind the mask of the detective. "What does he want?" "He's asking if you're sure about the perimeter," Thompson replied, holding out a folded slip of paper. "He thinks we should be pushing outwards, chasing shadows in the fog rather than guarding a graveyard." Wensley took the note, but didn't read it. He crumpled it slowly in his fist, the paper resisting before yielding to the pressure of his grip. "Tell the chief I am guarding the future, not the past. If we let them slip away now, this yard will be the start of a long winter. Tell him to trust my instinct or come down here and count the bodies himself." Thompson blinked, surprised by the sharpness in the inspector's tone, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded, turning to relay the message to the waiting constable. Wensley watched him go, then looked back at the dark window. The wind picked up again, whistling through the broken sash, creating a low, mournful sound that echoed off the brick walls. It sounded almost like a voice, whispering warnings that no one was listening to. He tightened his grip on the lapel of his coat, feeling the hard edge of the brass casing through the fabric. Let them come, he thought. Let them bring their politicians and their heavy guns. The hunt had begun, and the prey was not running. They were waiting. And in the frozen silence of the yard, Wensley knew that the next shot fired would not be in this alley, but somewhere deeper in the labyrinth of the docklands, where the fog was thickest and the walls were high. He pushed off the wall, his posture straightening, the exhaustion momentarily banished by the racing of his heart that comes before the storm. "Thompson," he called out, his voice carrying clearly over the wind. "Get the men mounted. We're moving to Sydney Street. I have a feeling that's where the trail leads next." The order hung in the air, a directive that would change the course of the week, the month, the history of the force. Thompson paused, the message to the chief forgotten in his hand, and looked at Wensley with a mixture of doubt and dawning realization. "Sydney Street?" Thompson asked, noting that it was miles from here. "What makes you sure?" Wensley didn't answer immediately. He just touched his pocket again, feeling the cold metal against his ribs, a secret shared between him and the dead men at his feet. "Because," he said, starting towards the gate, "they won't go far from the fire they've lit, and I intend to be there when it burns down." 3 days later, the fog had not lifted. It had only sunk lower, pressing into the pores of the brickwork until the very walls of Stepney seemed to sweat a grey, sulphurous slime. Wensley walked with his collar turned up, the wool scratching against a neck stiff from sleepless nights, each step on the cobbles sounding like a bone snapping in the damp quiet. He did not look at the sky. There was no sky here, only a ceiling of coal smoke and wet wool that tasted of copper pennies held too long under the tongue. The alley behind Houndsditch was a throat, narrow and choking, where the light from the gas lamps struggled to penetrate the gloom, dying a few feet from the glass in pools of sickly yellow that failed to illuminate the shadows clinging to the doorframes. Wensley stopped outside a shop front, the wood warped by years of humidity, the sign above peeling away to reveal the raw timber beneath. A bell jingled, sharp and out of place, as he pushed the door open, the scent of stale tobacco and pickled onions hitting him with the force of a physical blow. Behind the counter stood a man named Levine, though Wensley knew the name was likely a shield, a convenient Englishing of something sharper, something Slavic or Yiddish that had been filed down for safety. Levine's hands were busy counting out change for a customer who had already left, the coins clinking together in a rhythm that betrayed the tremor in his fingers. He did not look up. "Inspector," Levine said, the word dropping from his lips like a stone into a well, heavy and final. "We have spoken. There is nothing more." Wensley leaned against the counter, the wood greasy under his palms, leaving a faint smudge on the varnish that he did not bother to wipe away. He watched the man's hands, the knuckles white as he gripped a half-crown, the skin parchment thin and mapped with blue veins that spoke of a life spent indoors, away from the sun. "We spoke of the weather, Mr. Levine, of the cold. I am here to speak of the men who brought the cold with them." Wensley kept his voice low, a rumble that did not carry to the street outside, where the fog muffled the clip-clop of horses and the distant shout of a newsboy. "3 constables lie in the mortuary with holes in them that let the warmth out. You know who made those holes." Levine finally looked up, his eyes dark and watery, darting to the window and then back to the detective's face, searching for a mercy that was not there to be given. "I know nothing, I hear nothing. The walls here are thick, Inspector, but they are made of glass when it comes to secrets. Everyone sees, no one speaks." "Silence is a luxury, Mr. Levine, one your community cannot afford if the House of Commons decides to turn its gaze this way." Wensley reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for a notebook, the leather cover worn smooth by the friction of his thumb. He opened it, the pages rustling like dry leaves, and tapped a finger against a blank space. "Names, not yours, theirs, the ones who rented the room above the furrier, the ones who paid in gold and asked no questions." Levine shook his head, a jerky, mechanical motion, as if the strings controlling him were being pulled by a clumsy hand. If I speak, I am dead before the sun rises. If I do not speak, perhaps I live another day. You ask me to choose between a bullet and a slow starvation. It is no choice at all. A bullet is quick, Wensley said, closing the notebook with a snap that made the shopkeeper flinch. Starvation takes time. It eats you from the inside, piece by piece, until there is nothing left but the hunger. Think on that when you lock up tonight. He turned and left without waiting for a response, the bell jingling again, a cheerful sound that clashed violently with the heaviness in his chest. Outside, the fog had thickened, swirling around his legs like a living thing, eager to drag him down into the grime of the gutter. He pulled his gloves tighter, the leather creaking in protest, and began the walk towards the mortuary. The image of Levine's trembling hands burned into his mind. The mortuary was colder than the street, a vault of tiles, an iron where the air smelled of carbolic acid, and something sweeter, something cloying that coated the back of the throat. The attendant, a man with a face like a bulldog and hands that had washed too many bodies to count, nodded silently as Wensley entered, gesturing towards a tray on the far table. "Effects from the lodgings on Exchange Street," the attendant grunted, wiping his hands on a rag that was already stained beyond redemption. "Found under the floorboards. Seems they didn't want them found, but the fire started too soon." Wensley approached the tray, the metal cold enough to burn his skin through his gloves. On it lay a collection of mundane items, a broken comb, a few coins of foreign mint, a knife with a blade that had been honed to a razor's edge, and a pamphlet, its edges charred but the text still legible. He picked up the pamphlet, the paper brittle and dry, and unfolded it with a care that belied the violence of its origin. The text was in Russian, the Cyrillic letters stark and angular against the grey paper, speaking of overthrow, of the inevitable collapse of the state, of a future built on the ashes of the present. Wensley could not read the words, but he understood the tone, the feverish pitch of the syntax that demanded sacrifice, that glorified the act of destruction as a holy duty. He ran a gloved finger over the ink, feeling the slight ridge where the press had bitten into the fiber, imagining the hands that had printed this, the hands that had distributed it, the hands that had held the Mauser pistols in the alley 3 days prior. "They think they are writing history," Wensley murmured, the sound of his own voice strange in the tiled silence, "but they are only writing their own epitaphs." He folded the pamphlet and placed it in his pocket, next to the notebook, feeling the weight of it against his ribs, a tangible piece of the ideology that had cost 3 good men their lives. It was light, almost insubstantial, yet it carried the gravity of a tombstone. Back at his desk, the gaslight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the piles of reports, and the map of London spread out before him. He traced the route from Houndsditch to Sydney Street with a pencil, the graphite leaving a faint grey line that connected the dots of violence, a constellation of death that seemed to be moving inexorably eastward. His mind drifted, unbidden, to the autumn of '88, to the whispers of another killer who had walked these same streets, another ghost who had vanished into the fog without a trace. The Ripper had been a shadow, a rumor, a nightmare made flesh that had terrified the world, but he had been alone. These men were different. They were a cell, an organism, a hydra that grew 2 heads for every one that was cut off. They did not hide in the shadows. They sought the light, eager to burn themselves up in a spectacle that would ignite the powder keg of the East End. A knock at the door shattered his reverie, the sound sharp and urgent. A constable entered, his face flushed from the cold, holding a slip of paper that he offered with a trembling hand. "Message from the street, sir, from a source we've used before, won't give a name." Wensley took the note, the paper damp and smelling of cheap tobacco. He scanned the words, written in a hurried, jagged hand that spoke of fear and haste. "Cellar near Commercial Road, gathering tonight, men with foreign accents, armed." He looked up, the fatigue in his bones momentarily forgotten, replaced by the sharp, clear focus of the hunt. "Where exactly?" "Behind the pub on the corner of Christian Street, sir. The entrance is through the coal chute. They say they're planning something big, tonight." Wensley stood, grabbing his coat and hat, the movement fluid and decisive. "Get Thompson. Tell him to bring 2 men, no more. We don't want to spook them before we see who they are." "And the rest of the division, sir?" "No," Wensley said, buttoning his coat, his eyes hard. "Not yet. If this is them, I want to look them in the eye before I call in the army." He stepped out into the night, the fog wrapping around him like a shroud, the city holding its breath. The trail was hot, the scent of tobacco and revolution hanging in the air, leading him deeper into the warren where the walls were high and the exit was nowhere to be found. Somewhere in the mist, a shadow detached itself from a doorway, watched the detective pass, and vanished, leaving only the echo of a footstep and the promise of violence to come. The carbolic scent clung to his cuticles, a chemical ghost that no amount of scrubbing could dislodge. Wensley pushed open the door to his office, the wood swollen with damp, and stepped into the dim warmth of the gas jets. They hissed, a serpentine sound that filled the room, casting long, wavering shadows against the stacks of filed reports that lined the walls like neglected mourners. He hung his coat on the rack, the wet wool dripping onto the linoleum, and sat. The chair groaned. Thompson was already there, standing by the window, peering through the grime-streaked glass into the yellow murk outside. He turned as Wensley entered, holding a file that looked as though it had been dragged through a sewer. "Found them," Thompson said. His voice was flat, devoid of triumph. "The 88 papers. Took the archivist 20 minutes to dig them out from the basement. Said the rats had been nesting in the box." "Put them down." Thompson dropped the file on the desk. Dust motes danced in the updraft, swirling like agitated spirits before settling on the blotter. Wensley let the folder lie untouched, a sealed coffin on the wood. He rubbed his thumb over the edge of the cardboard, feeling the rough grain, thinking of the bodies on the iron trays downstairs. Levine's hands had been steady. These hands had shaken. "You're drawing a line," Thompson said, and it wasn't a question, "between then and now." "Aren't you?" Wensley opened the file. The photographs inside were gray and grainy, the faces of women frozen in the final rictus of violence, their eyes staring at a lens that captured only death. Jack worked alone. A butchercraft performed in the shadows. He took his prize and vanished into the warren. "And these Latvians?" "They perform in public." Wensley traced the route on the map spread beneath the file, the pencil moving from Houndsditch towards Sydney Street. The graphite line was faint, a scar on the paper. "They kill constables in a backyard, then retreat to a house they intend to burn. They want an audience. They want the flame." Thompson moved closer, the smell of stale tobacco and rain radiating from his coat. He leaned over the map, his finger hovering over the cluster of streets near the docks. "People are talking, Frederick, not to us, to each other, in the pubs along Commercial Road. They say the state is cracking, that these men are the hammer." "Let them talk." "It's not just talk, it's fear, the same fear that kept the Ripper safe for months within the silence of the poor." Thompson straightened up, rubbing a hand over his jaw while the stubble rasped against his palm. "You think you can outthink them, read their minds through dusty files?" "I think I can see where they must go." Wensley tapped the map. The Ripper had nowhere to go but deeper into the dark. These men, they are looking for an exit, a stage. "There is no exit." "There is always an exit." As Wensley looked up to meet Thompson's gaze, he saw the sergeant's eyes were tired and rimmed with red, reflecting the flickering gaslight, "even if it is only into the ground." Thompson snorted, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. He walked to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of water from a ceramic jug, the liquid glugging loudly in the quiet room. He handed one to Wensley. The glass was cold, condensation beading on the surface, wetting Wensley's fingers. He drank. The water tasted of iron and pipes. "You're exhausting yourself," Thompson said. "Churchill is asking for results. The papers are asking for blood. You are sitting here comparing anarchists to a ghost from 20 years ago." "The ghost is relevant." Wensley set the glass down, leaving a ring of moisture on the wood. "Because the city hasn't changed. The alleys are the same, and the poverty is the same. The only difference is the weapon." "And the politics?" "Politics is just a reason to pull the trigger." Wensley closed the file. The sound was final, like a coffin lid slamming shut. He leaned back, the leather of the chair creaking under his weight. He thought of the pamphlet in his pocket, the brittle paper scoring his sternum with every breath. Sokolov wanted martyrdom. Gardstein wanted dignity. They were not monsters. They were men who had decided that death was preferable to surrender. That made them dangerous. That made them predictable. The gaslight flickered, the flame dipping low as a draft swept through the room, then surged brighter, casting harsh highlights on the map. Wensley watched the flame. It danced, unstable, consuming the fuel that fed it. "We need more men," Thompson said softly. "If they are armed with Mausers, we cannot walk into a trap with Tupney revolvers." "Not yet, Frederick." "I said not yet." Wensley's voice was low, but it carried a weight that made Thompson step back. "If we swarm them, they die in the dark. I need them in the light. I need to know who they are before I put them in the ground." "You sound like you admire them." "I understand them." Wensley picked up his pen. The nib was cold. He dipped it into the inkwell, the black liquid viscous and deep. He hovered it over the report, waiting for the words to form, but his hand remained still. The ink gathered at the tip, a dark droplet ready to fall. "There is a difference." Thompson sighed, the sound of a man who had argued this battle too many times, and moved to the door with his hand on the latch. "Don't take too long." The cold was getting worse, while men shivered on the corners, unable to hold their positions forever. 10 minutes. "You have 5. Thompson opened the door. The noise from the outer office spilled in, the clatter of typewriters, the murmur of voices, the ring of the telephone. "Then I'm calling for reinforcements." He left, the door clicked shut. The silence returned, heavier than before. Wensley was alone with the map and the file and the hissing gas. He looked at the droplet of ink hanging from his nib. It trembled. He lowered the pen. The ink touched the paper and bloomed, a small black star that spread into the fibers. He thought of the East End as a living thing, a vast organism that digested men and excreted memory. It had swallowed the Ripper. It was trying to swallow Gardstein, but fire was different. Fire left ash. Fire left evidence. A knock at the door broke the stillness, sharp, urgent. Wensley did not look up immediately, watching instead as the ink stain dried and turned from wet gloss to matte black before he capped the pen, its metal click echoing in the room. "Enter," he said. The door opened. A constable stood there, face flushed, holding a slip of paper that trembled in his grip. The smell of cheap tobacco drifted in with him, sharp and acrid, cutting through the scent of old paper and gas. "Message from the street, sir," the constable said, his voice cracking as he added that it came from a source they had used before who refused to give a name. Wensley stood. The chair scraped against the floor. He walked around the desk, his boots heavy on the linoleum, and took the note. The paper was damp, cold from the outside air. He unfolded it. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. "Down in the cellar near Commercial Road, a gathering unfolds tonight, filled with men speaking in foreign accents who are all armed." He read it once, then again. The words did not change. He looked at the constable. "Where exactly?" "Behind the pub on the corner of Christian Street, sir. The entrance is through the coal chute. They say they're planning something big tonight." Wensley folded the note and placed it in his pocket next to the pamphlet. 2 pieces of paper, one ideology, one location. The hunt was no longer a theory. It was a destination. "Get Thompson," Wensley said, instructing him to bring 2 men and no more. "And the rest of the division, sir?" "No." Wensley grabbed his coat from the rack. The wool was still damp, cold against his shoulders. "Not yet. If this is them, I want to look them in the eye before I call in the army." He moved past the constable, into the corridor, towards the stairs and the night. The ink on his fingers was dry, but the stain remained, a mark of the work that waited in the dark. The floorboard groaned under Sokolov's boot, a sharp complaint in the freezing air that sounded like a gunshot to his own ears. He froze, one foot suspended, muscles coiled tight as a spring wound to breaking point. Gardstein did not flinch. He sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs long since crushed flat, and continued to stare at the wall where the plaster had peeled away to reveal the lath beneath. The room smelled of damp wool, stale tobacco, and the coppery tang of the revolver oil Sokolov had been using. It was a small, suffocating box on the second floor of a terraced house in Stepney, a place where the fog seeped through the cracks in the sash windows and settled on the skin like a second layer of grime. "They will hear that," Sokolov whispered, the words harsh and grated out from a throat dry with fear. "The whole building will hear." "Let them hear," Gardstein replied, his voice low, almost conversational, though his eyes remained fixed on the peeling paint. "The walls are thin, the lives inside them are thinner. They hear everything and say nothing. That is the bargain of this street." Sokolov lowered his foot, placing it carefully on the next board, testing the wood before committing his weight. He moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains that were stained yellow with years of coal smoke. Below, the street was a grey river of mist, the gaslights nothing more than blurred halos that failed to penetrate the gloom. A cart rumbled past, the iron rims of the wheels clattering on the cobbles, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the afternoon. "We cannot stay here," Sokolov said, turning from the window. His hands were shaking, a fine tremor that he tried to hide by clenching them into fists. "The police are closer. I can feel them. They are like dogs sniffing at the door." "Feelings are for poets, William. We have facts." Gardstein finally looked up. His face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp enough to cut, and his eyes were dark pools that reflected none of the dim light in the room. "The fact is that the correspondence is still under the floor. The fact is that if they find it, they find everyone, not just us, the others, the ones who gave us shelter, the ones who printed the pamphlets." He gestured to the floorboards near the fireplace, where a section had been pried loose and then replaced, the nails driven back in at slightly different angles. Inside that void lay a bundle of letters, names, and addresses that could dismantle the entire network of Latvian anarchists in London. It was not just paper, it was lives. "Burn it," Sokolov said. The suggestion hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. "Burn it all. Let the fire take the evidence." No, Gardstein's refusal was absolute, a slab of granite dropped into the room. "Fire draws attention. Fire brings the brigade. Fire brings the crowd. We need to move it. We need to take it to Sydney Street." "Sydney Street," Sokolov laughed, a short, brittle sound that lacked any humor because that is a trap. "It is a main road, so there is no way out." "It is a statement," Gardstein corrected, rising with stiff movements as his joints cracked in the cold. "If we die where they can see us, where the smoke can be seen for miles. We do not hide in a hole like rats." "We are not dead yet." "No, but we are finished." Gardstein walked to the table and picked up the Mauser pistol that lay there. He checked the magazine, the metal clicking softly as he slid it back into place. "The question is not whether we survive. The question is how we end. Do we let them drag us out in chains? Do we let them put us in a cage and hang us like common criminals? Or do we make them pay for every inch?" Sokolov looked at the gun, then at the floorboards, then back at Gardstein. He felt a surge of something that was not quite courage and not quite despair. It was a fatalistic clarity, a sudden understanding that the path ahead was narrow and led only one way. He thought of the workers in the docks, the men who broke their backs loading ships for pennies, the women who sewed until their fingers bled. They needed a symbol. They needed a fire that would not go out. "The oil," Sokolov said softly. "We can use the oil to slow them down, to make the heat greater." Gardstein nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin. "Yes, the oil and the paraffin from the lamp." They worked in silence then, the only sound the scratch of wood on wood as they lifted the floorboards again. The dust rose in a cloud, choking and thick, making Sokolov cough. He reached into the hole, his fingers brushing against the rough paper of the bundle. It felt heavy, weighted with the secrets of 100 men. He pulled it out and placed it on the table. Outside, a door slammed. Both men froze. The sound was distant, muffled by the fog and the layers of brick, but it was distinct. A voice followed, low and indistinct, drifting up from the street below. Then another voice, not the rough cockney of the locals, but something sharper, more authoritative. Sokolov moved to the window again, pressing his ear against the cold glass. He could see nothing but the grey swirl of the mist, but he could hear the rhythm of footsteps on the pavement below. Slow, deliberate, stopping. "They are here," he whispered, the blood draining from his face. Gardstein did not move to the window. He simply picked up the bundle of letters and tucked it inside his coat, against his chest. He picked up the Mauser in his right hand and the can of paraffin in his left. "Then we go," he said, "to Sydney Street." "But the stairs, sir." "Not the stairs." Gardstein moved to the door that led to the adjoining room, the one that shared a wall with the empty house next door. "Through the party wall. We break through. We go over the roofs." "That is madness. The tiles are frozen. We will slip." "Better to break a neck than to hang." Gardstein raised the butt of the pistol. "Help me." Sokolov hesitated for a fraction of a second, the primal instinct for self-preservation screaming at him to hide, to curl up in the corner and wait for it to be over. But then he looked at Gardstein, at the grim set of the man's jaw, and he felt that strange, terrible pull of the cause again. He stepped forward and grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. Together they struck the plaster. The sound was dull, a thud that vibrated up their arms, but it was enough. A crack appeared, thin and jagged. They struck again, harder this time, and a piece of lath broke away, falling to the floor with a clatter. Through the hole, the darkness of the empty house stared back at them. It smelled of decay and rats. "Go," Gardstein ordered. Sokolov climbed through the gap, scraping his shoulder against the rough timber, and dropped into the room beyond. The floor was covered in dust and debris. He turned and helped Gardstein through, pulling the older man into the shadows just as the sound of heavy boots echoed on the stairs of their own room. They stood in the darkness of the empty house, listening to the police enter the room they had just vacated. Voices murmured, confused by the empty space, the open floorboards, the cold stove. "They will find the hole," Sokolov breathed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Let them find it," Gardstein said, moving towards the window that looked out over the rooftops. The fog was thinner here, higher up, and he could see the jagged line of chimneys stretching away towards the river. "By the time they work it out, we will be gone, and the fire will come later." He looked at Sokolov, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "To Sydney Street," Gardstein repeated, "and let the world watch us burn." Sokolov nodded, gripping the poker tight until his knuckles turned white. There was no going back now. The die was cast, the path chosen. They climbed onto the roof, the tiles slick with ice, and began the treacherous journey across the skyline of Stepney, leaving the police to search an empty room while the real hunt moved silently above their heads towards the street that would soon become a legend. Below, in the room they had fled, a detective inspector stepped over the broken floorboards and touched the cold stove, his face grim as he realized the birds had flown, but the nest still held the scent of smoke. The frost on the tiles bit through the thin sole of Sokolov's boot, a sharp, needle-like pain that grounded him in the terrifying reality of the rooftop. Below, the fog swirled like spilled milk, obscuring the street where the police now swarmed the empty room they had fled moments before. He could hear their voices, muffled and frustrated, drifting up through the chimney pots like the murmurs of confused ghosts. "Keep low," Gardstein hissed, his voice barely audible over the wind that whipped at their coats. "The slate is slick as glass." Sokolov nodded, though the motion felt stiff, his muscles locked in a rigid tension that refused to release. He watched Gardstein move ahead, a dark silhouette against the grey sky, stepping with a precarious grace from one chimney stack to another. The older man carried the paraffin can in one hand and the Mauser in the other, balancing them as if they were extensions of his own limbs, weights that anchored him to the earth even as he walked the sky. It was madness. The thought struck Sokolov with the force of a physical blow, momentarily dizzying him. They were two men, hunted like dogs, traversing the Frozine AE sense of London's East End while the entire machinery of the state scrambled below them. Yet beneath the fear, that strange, feverish heat bloomed in his chest again. This was the spectacle. Not the hiding, not the scurrying through sewers, but this, the audacity of movement when all others would cower. A tile shifted under Sokolov's foot, skidding sideways with a dry, grating scrape that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. He froze, arms windmilling instinctively to regain balance, his breath catching in a ragged gasp. Below, a voice shouted. An electric torch beam cut through the fog, sweeping erratically across the rooftops before dying out again. Down, Gardstein commanded, dropping instantly into a crouch behind a broad brick flue. Sokolov followed suit, pressing himself against the cold, damp masonry. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat that seemed loud enough to betray their position to every ear in Stepney. He closed his eyes for a second, forcing the air into his lungs, trying to steady the tremor in his hands. The smell of soot and wet wool filled his nose, mingling with the sharp, chemical tang of the paraffin leaking slightly from the can Gardstein held. "They suspect," Sokolov whispered, the words forming white clouds in the freezing air. "They know we are above them." "Let them suspect," Gardstein replied, his tone devoid of fear, stripped down to a hard, practical core. "Suspicion is not capture. We have the height, we have the dark." He peered around the edge of the chimney, sweeping his gaze across the jagged landscape of roofs that stretched towards Commercial Road. Sydney Street is 3 streets over. The house stands alone at the end. It has a clear view of the road, a perfect stage. "A stage for what?" Sokolov asked, though he already knew the answer, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "For the end," Gardstein said simply, "for the fire that will wake them all." He stood up again, signaling for Sokolov to follow. The journey resumed, a treacherous dance of leap and cling, their boots finding purchase on the icy slates only through sheer desperation. The city unfolded beneath them, a labyrinth of brick and shadow, unaware that 2 men were crossing its spine to deliver a final, violent message. Sokolov's legs burned with exertion, the cold seeping into his bones, but he kept his eyes fixed on Gardstein's back, following the path of a man who had already accepted his own death and found a terrible freedom in it. Detective Inspector Frederick Wensley stood in the center of the abandoned room, the dust from the broken plaster settling slowly around him like snow. The hole in the party wall gaped open, a jagged mouth leading into the darkness of the adjoining house. He ran a gloved finger along the rough edge of the lath, feeling the splinters catch on the wool. "They didn't go down," Thompson said, appearing in the doorway, his face flushed from the climb up the stairs. "The front door is still bolted from the inside, back doors chained. They're not on the street, Frederick." Wensley turned, his gaze sweeping the room, lingering on the overturned table, the scattered papers that meant nothing, and the cold stove that still held a faint warmth. "Up," he said quietly. "They've gone up." Thompson frowned, stepping carefully over the debris. "The roof, in this frost, it's suicide." "Desperation makes acrobats of us all, John," Wensley replied, moving towards the window. He pushed it open, the sash groaning in protest, and leaned out into the biting wind. The fog below was thick, impenetrable, but above, the skyline was a jagged silhouette against the dim glow of the city lights. He swept his gaze across the rooftops, searching for movement, for a shadow that moved against the wind. Nothing, just the endless row of chimneys, silent and still. "Get men on the roofs," Wensley ordered, pulling his head back inside and closing the window against the chill. "Carefully, if they slip, I don't want their deaths on my conscience too, but do not let them out of sight." "And if they make it to the next street?" Thompson asked, his hand resting on the butt of his Webley. "Then we follow," Wensley said, his voice hardening as he declared that wherever they go, we must follow, for they cannot hide forever, not when they carry so much fire inside them. He looked back at the hole in the wall, the dark passage that led to the empty house next door. It felt like a trick, a sleight of hand designed to waste precious minutes while the quarry vanished into the labyrinth of the East End. But Wensley knew the type of men they were hunting. Men who preferred death to surrender did not run to hide. They ran to find a better place to die. "Check the line of sight towards Sydney Street," Wensley added, a sudden intuition prickling at the back of his neck. "If I were looking for a final stand, that's where I'd go. High ground, clear view." Thompson nodded, already turning to relay the order. "I'll send Miller ahead to scout," quietly. Wensley watched him go, then turned back to the room. The silence here was heavy, laden with the echo of the anarchists' hurried escape. He could almost feel their presence still, the residual heat of their fear and their fanaticism hanging in the air. It was a strange intimacy, this pursuit, a dance where the partners never touched but knew each other's steps by heart. He walked over to the table and picked up the iron poker Sokolov had left behind. It was cold, heavy, stained with the dust of the broken wall. He turned it over in his hands, examining the rough metal, wondering about the man who had wielded it. What thoughts had gone through his head as he struck the plaster? Had he hesitated? Had he feared the fall more than the noose? There were no answers in the room, only the dust and the cold. Wensley placed the poker back on the hearth and adjusted his coat. The hunt was not over. It had merely changed elevation, moving from the cramped interiors of the slums to the dangerous, exposed heights of the city's roofline. And somewhere out there, in the fog and the frost, two men were running towards a destiny they had chosen for themselves, leaving a trail of smoke that Wensley knew would soon engulf them all. He stepped towards the door, his boots crunching on the broken lath. "Come on, John," he called out to his sergeant. "The game is afoot, and the stakes have never been higher." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of sirens and the murmur of a crowd gathering below, drawn by the promise of violence. Wensley ignored them, focusing instead on the path ahead, the invisible line that connected the broken room to the street where the final act would play out. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and stepped out into the hallway, ready to climb. The ladder iron bit into Wensley's palm, rust flaking away like dried blood under his grip. Below, the alley yawned, a throat of darkness, swallowing the faint glow of the lantern Thompson held. "Steady," Wensley called down, his voice snagging on the wind. "Don't let the lights swing." Thompson grunted as he shifted his weight on the slick cobbles. "It's the frost, Frederick, making everything slip," he said, "even the truth." Wensley hauled himself onto the slate roof, the tiles biting through the knees of his trousers. The cold here was sharper, unfiltered by the grime of the street, stripping the heat from his bones with an efficiency that felt personal. He crouched, scanning the ridgeline where the chimneys stood like broken teeth against the gray sky. Nothing moved. The fog clung to the lower streets, a thick wool blanket smothering the tangle of docks and tenements below, but up here the air was clear and brittle. "See anything?" Thompson's head appeared over the parapet, his cap askew, breath pluming in white bursts. "Shadows," Wensley said, "too many of them." He moved forward, boots crunching on soot-stained snow that had gathered in the gutters. The rooftops formed a jagged archipelago, separated by narrow chasms that a desperate man might leap, but a cautious one would avoid. Wensley knew the men they hunted were not cautious. They were fueled by something hotter than survival, a fervor that made gravity seem like a suggestion rather than a law. He remembered the hole in the wall of the previous room, the rough edges of the brickwork where the mortar had surrendered to the iron poker. Sokolov had not cared about the fall. He had cared only about the distance between him and the police. "Miller's reported in from the next terrace," Thompson said, joining him, his Webley drawn and held low against his thigh. "Says he saw a figure duck behind the stack at number 98, moving fast. Towards Sydney Street. Keeping to the high ground." Wensley nodded, the motion stiff. The intuition that had prickled his neck in the empty room now solidified into a cold certainty. They were not running away, they were maneuvering. Every step they took across these slippery slates was a calculation, a positioning for a final stand. He looked towards the distant silhouette of Sydney Street, barely visible through the thinning mist. It waited, silent and imposing, a stage set for a tragedy that had already been written in the blood of 3 constables. "We lose them up here, John, and we lose the city," Wensley said, his voice dropping to a murmur that the wind almost stole. "They know the layout better than we do. They've walked these roofs in the dark while we were warming our hands by the station fire." "Then we don't walk," Thompson replied, his grip tightening on the revolver as he added that they would crawl instead. "And we shoot if we have to. There would be no more warnings." Wensley flinched, a microscopic tightening of the jaw that Thompson did not see. The memory of Houndsditch flashed, unbidden and violent, the crack of the Mauser, the way Bentley had crumpled without a sound, the sudden, terrible stillness of a man who would never draw breath again. He pushed the image down, burying it under the immediate demand of the chase. There would be time for ghosts later. Now there was only the slate, the frost, and the men ahead. "Keep your men spaced," Wensley ordered, starting forward again, his body low to the roof. "If they double back, I want a net, not a line. And for God's sake, watch your footing. I won't have another widow to visit before breakfast." He moved in a crouch, a procession of dark coats against the grey slate, silent as cats. The silence of the rooftops was different from the silence of the street. It was expansive, filled with the distant rumble of traffic and the cry of gulls that smelled the river nearby. It made the sound of their own breathing seem loud, an intrusion on the morning's quiet. Wensley focused on the rhythm of his steps, matching Thompson's pace, keeping his eyes fixed on the chimney stack where Miller had spotted the movement. A piece of loose slate shifted under Wensley's boot, skittering down the slope with a sharp clatter that echoed like a gunshot. He froze, heart hammering like a trapped bird in his chest, waiting for the return fire that did not come. "Easy," Thompson whispered, his hand clamping onto Wensley's shoulder. "Just the roof settling." Wensley exhaled, his breath clouding in front of him as he realized it wasn't the roof but them, for they were waiting. He pointed ahead. Behind the next chimney stack, a wisp of smoke curled upwards, thin and grey, vanishing almost instantly into the overcast sky. It was not the heavy black plume of a house fire, but the faint signature of a match struck in the cold. Someone was there. Someone was smoking, or perhaps burning a paper, destroying the last traces of their identity before the end. "Do we rush?" Thompson asked, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. "No," Wensley said, shaking his head slowly. "If we rush, they jump, and if they jump, they might land in the street where the crowd is gathering. We pin them, drive them towards Sydney Street." He looked at the target, the invisible line connecting their current position to the terraced house that loomed in his mind's eye. It was a gamble, relying on the anarchists' desire for a dramatic exit rather than a quiet disappearance. But Wensley knew the type. They wanted the world to see. They wanted the brick and the breath to collide in a spectacle that would ignite the papers for weeks. "Signal Miller to flank left," Wensley instructed, his voice regaining its steel as he added, "We push them gently, like herding sheep into a pen." Thompson nodded, pulling a whistle from his pocket but stopping before blowing it. He used hand signals instead, sharp jerks of his gloved hand that cut through the gloom. The other detectives, scattered along the ridge, responded in kind, shifting their positions with a sluggish grace. The net was tightening, invisible but palpable, drawing closer around the two men who had chosen to die standing up. Wensley felt a strange kinship with them, a dark resonance that he refused to name. They were all trapped in this moment, bound by duty or ideology to an outcome that none of them could escape. The frost bit deeper, numbing his fingers, but he did not adjust his gloves. He kept his eyes on the smoke, on the faint disturbance in the air that marked the presence of his quarry. "Ready," Thompson mouthed, raising his weapon. Wensley raised his own, the Webley feeling heavy and familiar in his hand. He took a breath, tasting the soot and the cold, and prepared to step forward into the final act. The rooftops ended abruptly at the edge of Sydney Street, dropping away into the void where the house waited. There was no going back now. The game had moved beyond pursuit into something far more absolute. A shadow detached itself from the chimney stack ahead, a fleeting glimpse of a hat brim and a coat collar before vanishing again. They were moving. The trap was sprung. "Go," Wensley said, and the word was lost in the wind as they surged forward, the slate cracking under their boots, the chase narrowing down to the distance of a single street. The surge forward collapsed into a stuttering halt before they cleared the ridge. Wensley's boot skidded on a patch of black ice, sending him lurching sideways into Thompson, who grabbed the lapel of his greatcoat to keep them both from sliding down the guttering and into the street below. The momentum died instantly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness that felt less like caution and more like the holding of breath before a dive into freezing water. They were too exposed here. The slate offered no cover, only a grey expanse that any eye looking up from a dormer window would pick out against the sky. "Down," Wensley hissed, dropping to his knees and dragging Thompson with him. "Stay low, they'll be watching the angles." They crawled now, knees grinding against the rough grit of the roofing tiles, moving with the sluggish, deliberate pace of men carrying the weight of the dead on their backs. The air down here, closer to the street level, tasted different. It carried the greasy smoke of 1,000 domestic fires mixed with the sharp, acrid tang of horse urine rising from the cobbles. It was the smell of the slum district stirring, indifferent to the drama playing out above its head. Wensley kept his gaze fixed on the target, 100 Sydney Street. The terraced house stood squat and unremarkable amidst its neighbors, a brick throat waiting to be cut. From this vantage point, the windows were dark eyes behind drawn curtains. Thick, heavy drapes blocked the view inside, turning the far A-tilde section a day into a blank mask that gave nothing away. It was exactly as it had been in Houndsditch. The memory struck Wensley with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, vivid recall of the Jew's court backyard. The same stillness, the same deceptive quiet before the Mausers had opened up and turned three good men into meat on the frozen ground. He could almost hear the echo of Bentley's last gasp, the wet rattle in the throat that no doctor could fix. His hand tightened on the Webley until the knuckles turned white beneath the leather gloves. "Do you see movement?" Thompson whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant clatter of a cart wheel on stone. Wensley squinted, shielding his eyes from the glare of the weak winter sun reflecting off the frost. "Nothing yet, just the shadows playing tricks." "It's too quiet, Frederick, even for a Monday morning." "That's the point," Wensley muttered, shifting his weight to ease the cramp in his thigh. "They know we're coming. They've been watching us since we left the station. They're waiting for us to make the first mistake." He scanned the row of houses again, looking for the telltale sign of life. A shift in the fabric of a curtain, a glint of glass, the puff of breath against a pane. There was nothing. The house sat in the center of the street like a tomb, sealed tight against the world. Yet Wensley felt the presence of the men inside as clearly as if they were standing beside him on the roof. Gardstein and Sokoloff. Two names that had become synonyms for blood and fire in the police reports, but here, in the flesh, they were just two men trapped in a room with no exit. He wondered what they were doing in there, cleaning their weapons, burning papers, or simply sitting in the dark, listening to the footsteps of the hunters closing in. The irony was not lost on him. They were all actors in a play written by someone else, following a script that demanded a bloody finale. The anarchists wanted their martyrdom, the politicians wanted their victory, and Wensley just wanted to go home without adding more names to the list of the dead. He pulled a notebook from his inner pocket, the leather cover stiff with cold, and flipped it open to a blank page. He needed to set this down to make it real before the chaos started. The ink flowed sluggishly from his fountain pen, leaving thick, dark blobs on the paper as he sketched the layout of the street. "Listen to me," he said, not looking up from the page. "We do not rush the front door, not yet. If we kick it in, they'll fire through the wood and take half the team with them. We need to surround the perimeter, cut off the rear exit first." "The rear leads into the yard," Thompson noted, tracing the line of Wensley's sketch with a gloved finger. "It's narrow, a bottleneck." "Exactly. Put Miller there with two men, telling them to hold fire unless fired upon. I want them alive, John. I want to know who supplied the guns and the names of the people who bought the bullets." "And if they shoot?" Wensley capped his pen, the click sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet air. "Then we shoot back, harder." He closed the notebook and shoved it back into his pocket, feeling the hard edge of it against his ribs. It was a flimsy plan, born of desperation and the hope that surprise might still be on their side. But the element of surprise was a fragile thing, easily shattered by a loose slate or a nervous constable. He looked at Thompson, seeing the tension in the other man's jaw, the way his eyes darted nervously towards the curtained windows. They were all feeling it now, the tightening of the net, the inevitable pull towards violence. "Get the men into position," Wensley ordered, his voice low and steady. "Move slow, no running, make them think it's just another morning in Stepney." Thompson nodded and began to shuffle backwards, signaling to the others with sharp, jerky movements of his hand. The detectives melted away along the roofline, disappearing behind chimney stacks and dormer windows like ghosts returning to their grave. Wensley remained where he was, alone with the view of the house. He watched the front door, painted a peeling green that flaked away to reveal the grey wood beneath. It looked ordinary, innocent. A place where a family might live, where children might play in the scullery, but he knew better. Behind that door lay the machinery of death. A sudden movement caught his eye. In the window on the first floor, the heavy curtain twitched. Just a fraction of an inch, a subtle disturbance in the fabric that might have been missed by anyone less obsessed, less attuned to the language of fear. Then a shadow passed behind it. A figure, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a purpose that suggested readiness rather than retreat. The silhouette raised an arm, perhaps adjusting the curtain, perhaps raising a weapon. Wensley stopped breathing. The world narrowed down to that single square of fabric, that fleeting glimpse of the enemy. The doubt evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. They were there. Gardstein and Sokolov were inside, and they were waiting for the dawn to break fully so they could make their stand. The trap was no longer a possibility. It was a reality, sprung and snapping shut around them all. He raised his hand, signaling Thompson to hold. The signal was unnecessary. The sergeant had already seen it. The entire team froze, weapons drawn, eyes fixed on the green door below. The street remained empty, the few early pedestrians hurrying past without noticing the drama unfolding above them. The fog was lifting now, burning off in patches to reveal the stark, grim faces of the buildings, stripping away the concealment of the mist. There would be no hiding now. No slipping away into the yellow soup of the London morning. Wensley checked the cylinder of his Webley, ensuring the bullets were seated tight. The metal was cold against his palm, biting into his skin. He thought of the 3 constables in the mortuary, their faces covered by sheets, their families waiting for news that would never come. He thought of the fire that would soon consume this street, the brick and the breath colliding in a spectacular ruin. There was no turning back. The net was tight, the prey was cornered, and the only thing left to do was to pull the trigger. He watched the curtain twitch again, a final, silent invitation. "Ready the battering ram," Wensley whispered to the empty air, his voice lost in the wind that swept down from the river. "It starts now." Wood splintered. The ram struck the green paint with a dull, wet thud that shuddered up the arms of the 2 constables wielding it, sending a shower of flakes onto the flagstones. A second hit tore the lock from its housing, and the door swung inward on protesting hinges, revealing a throat of darkness that smelled of stale tobacco and unwashed wool. Wensley stepped over the threshold first, Webley raised, the cold steel biting into his palm. Dust motes danced in the shaft of grey morning light that cut through the broken door, illuminating particles of plaster and old grease suspended in the air. "Clear left," Thompson whispered, though the words snagged in his throat. They moved into the hallway, boots scraping on grit-covered floorboards. The space was narrow, boxed in by walls papered in a pattern of faded roses that had long since browned at the edges. To the right, a counter suggested a shop once operated here, now stripped bare except for a layer of grey fur that coated every surface. Nothing moved. The silence pressed against their ears, heavy and expectant, waiting to be broken. Wensley signaled forward with a jerk of his chin, his eyes fixed on the staircase, rising ahead like a gallows. "Check the rear," Wensley said. "Miller, take the kitchen." Miller nodded, slipping past them into the shadows of the scullery. The rest of the team fanned out, 6 men compressed into a space meant for 1 family, their breaths visible in the chill air. Wensley advanced towards the stairs, each step calculated to avoid the creaking joints of the wood. He could feel the weight of the notebook in his pocket, its sharp corner digging into his side like a lodged stone, a reminder of the names he needed to write down rather than the bullets he might have to fire. The smell grew stronger here, pungent with the residue of cheap tobacco smoke that had soaked into the plaster over weeks of confinement. A floorboard groaned above. Wensley froze, his finger tightened on the trigger guard, not the trigger itself, holding the shot until the target presented. The shadow on the landing shifted. It was not a retreat, it was an adjustment of stance. "Hands where I can see them," Wensley called out, his voice echoing off the narrow walls. "Come out slowly." No answer, only the sound of fabric rustling, the distinct click of metal on wood. "Down," Thompson shouted. The crack came before the sound of the command had fully faded, a sharp, high-velocity snap that differed entirely from the blunt report of a police Webley. A Mauser. The bullet struck the newel post inches from Wensley's head, spraying splinters into his eye. He flinched, blinking away the sting, as a second shot punched through the air where his chest had been a fraction of a second prior. The hallway erupted into chaos, deafening noise confined in a small space. Thompson grabbed the collar of Wensley's coat, yanking him sideways behind the bulk of a heavy wardrobe. "Get back, Frederick, they're elevated." Wensley scrambled, his boots slipping on the dusty floor, and pressed his spine against the wood of the wardrobe. Another bullet chipped the paintwork above them, sending a shard of wood grazing his cheek. He could hear the others shouting, the chaotic return fire from the constables in the hall, but the angles were wrong. The staircase offered the suspects a perfect kill zone, a funnel where any man standing upright became a target. "Cease fire," Wensley yelled, though his voice was swallowed by the roar of the exchange. "Hold your fire." He peered around the edge of the wardrobe, just for an instant. A shadow moved on the landing again, calm and deliberate, reloading with a mechanical efficiency that spoke of training rather than panic. This was not a frightened burglar hiding in an attic. This was a soldier holding a fort. The air tasted of cordite now, acrid and biting, mixing with the stale tobacco to create a nausea-inducing fog within the house. "Miller," Thompson screamed towards the rear. "Status." "Clear back here," Miller's voice came back, thin and strained, yet he couldn't reach the stairs because they had barred the landing. Wensley wiped the splinters from his cheek, feeling the warmth of blood mixing with the dust on his skin. He looked at Thompson, seeing the wide stare of a man recalculating the odds. The initial plan, the hope of surprise, lay shattered on the floorboards alongside the lock from the door. They had walked into a trap built of brick and timber, designed to turn their own numbers against them. Every step forward cost blood. "We can't rush it," Wensley said, his voice rough. "They'll pick us off one by one." "Then what do we do?" Thompson asked, checking the cylinder of his revolver. "We can't sit here while they shoot down at us like ducks in a barrel." Another shot rang out, striking the floor between them with a spark. Wensley recoiled, pressing harder against the wardrobe. The wood vibrated under his shoulder, transmitting the impact of the bullets like a drumbeat. He thought of Tucker and Bentley, of the cold slabs in the mortuary, and the wives waiting for answers that no longer seemed to matter in the face of this firepower. The law demanded an arrest, but the geometry of the house demanded a war. "Fall back to the door," Wensley ordered. "Regroup outside." "Are you mad?" Thompson snapped, though he was already moving. "If we turn our backs, sir." "Do it." They moved in a crouch, scrambling backward towards the shattered entrance, keeping the bulk of the furniture between them and the stairs. The firing continued, precise and relentless, tracking their movement with a predator's patience. Wensley reached the doorway and rolled out onto the pavement, gasping for air that did not taste of gunpowder. The grey light of the street felt blindingly bright after the gloom of the hall. Thompson collapsed beside him, clutching his arm, a graze bleeding slowly through the wool of his uniform. "They're not coming out," Thompson said, pressing a handkerchief to the wound. "They're dug in." Wensley looked up at the first-floor window. The curtain twitched again, a mock salute from the shadows within. The house stood silent from the outside, betraying none of the violence contained within its walls, while inside, two men had turned a terraced home into a fortress that defied the standard methods of policing. The numerical superiority of the police meant nothing against a fortified position held by men willing to die. He stood up, brushing the dust from his trousers, and looked down the street. The noise of the gunfire had already drawn attention. Heads appeared at neighboring windows. A cart halted further down the road, the driver staring towards the commotion. The secrecy of the operation was dead, buried under the smoke of the first exchange. "Send a runner to the station," Wensley said, his voice flat, demanding they send more men and bring rifles. "Rifles?" Thompson asked, wincing as he tied the cloth tight. "You mean the tower?" "I mean anything that punches through brick," Wensley replied, watching the green door as if it might open to reveal the devil himself. "This isn't an arrest anymore, John. It's a siege." The crowd began to gather at the edges of the cordon, drawn by the scent of violence like flies to meat. Wensley ignored them, his focus locked on the upper windows where the shadows waited. The first wave of reinforcements was minutes away, but the real battle had already begun, and the house held all the cards. The cold hit them first, a slap of January air against skin still heated by the hallway's stale fever. Wensley straightened his collar, fingers brushing the dust on his lapel, and turned to face the street. The pavement was no longer empty. Men in flat caps, women shawled against the damp, stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the green door of number 100. They did not cheer. They watched with the stillness of birds waiting for a fox to emerge from its den. Push them back, Wensley said, demanding they retreat 10 yards to clear the line of fire. A young constable, face pale beneath his helmet, stepped forward but hesitated. A woman in the front row clutched a basket of coal, her knuckles white, refusing to move. "Did you hear the inspector?" Thompson's voice cracked like a whip. He held his wounded arm close to his chest, the handkerchief already darkening to a deep, wet crimson. "Move, or I'll have you up for obstruction." The woman flinched, but held her ground. She looked past Thompson, past the blood on his sleeve, to the blacked-out windows above. Something moved behind the lace, a shadow shifting against the glass. "Down!" Wensley threw himself flat. The crack of a Mauser shattered the morning calm. Brick dust sprayed from the wall beside Thompson's head, stinging his cheek. The crowd scattered then, a ripple of panic breaking the human wall, screams tearing through the fog as they stumbled over one another to find cover behind carts and doorways. The constable who had hesitated dropped to his knees, hands over his ears, shaking. "Get up," Wensley snapped as he grabbed the man's tunic, declaring that he must either die on his feet or go home. "Choose." He hauled the constable to his feet and shoved him towards the corner of the building. The geometry of the street was wrong, narrow, exposed. The house loomed over them, a brick throat ready to swallow another handful of men. Upstairs, the curtain twitched again, deliberate, mocking. "They're covering the approach," Thompson said, pressing his back against the brickwork of the neighboring house. "We can't get close without a shield." "Then we don't get close." As Wensley scanned the rooftops, chimney pots stood jagged against the pale sky like silent sentinels. There was no movement there, not yet. "Keep them pinned, and don't return fire unless you have a clear shot, for I won't have bullets flying into the tenements." "And if they shoot us? Then we bleed." Wensley walked the line, boots crunching on the grit of the road. He positioned men behind every available obstacle, a water cart, a stack of timber, the stone plinth of a gas lamp. Each order was short, sharp, leaving no room for debate. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him from the safety of the sidelines. They knew him. Some of them remembered the Ripper years, the failures, the bodies pulled from the Thames. Today, they waited to see if he would add his own name to the list of the dead. A shot rang out from the first floor. Wood splintered on the water cart. The horse reared, snorting, eyes rolling white in terror, until a groom grabbed the reins and dragged it behind a wall. "Steady," Wensley roared. He looked at Thompson. The sergeant was tying a fresh strip of cloth around his arm, teeth gritted against the pain. "Run her back to Commercial Road," Wensley said, ordering them to tell the others to bring the heavy section while also getting the fire brigade standing by. "Fire brigade," Thompson frowned, wincing as he pulled the knot tight. "You think they'll burn it?" "I think they'll die before they surrender." As Wensley turned back to the house, the windows gaped like dark mouths swallowing the light. "If they light a match, we need water, not just for the building, but for the whole street." Thompson nodded slowly, understanding that the anarchists had chosen their end. Not a cell in Wormwood Scrubs, but ash. A man in a bowler hat pushed through the cordon, notebook in hand. A pressman, Wensley stepped into his path, blocking the view of the door. "Back," Wensley said. "Public interest, Inspector," the man replied, shielding his eyes from the cold. "The Empire needs to know how justice is served." "Justice is served in silence, not in print." Wensley shoved him gently but firmly towards the crowd. "Get behind the line. If you cross it, I'll confiscate that book and throw you in with them." The writer hesitated, then retreated, muttering something about censorship. Wensley ignored him. The press would print what they liked regardless. The story was already writing itself in the brick dust on the pavement. More constables arrived, jogging in formation from the direction of Aldgate. They carried rifles, the wood stocks gleaming with oil. The sound of their boots on the cobbles was rhythmic, heavy, a drumbeat of state power arriving to crush the anomaly. Wensley watched them take position. The balance of the street shifted. No longer a police action, an occupation. He walked to the center of the road, exposed. Thompson grabbed his shoulder. "Don't be a target, Frederick. Someone has to show them we aren't afraid." "We are afraid." Thompson's voice was low, rough with exhaustion. Men who aren't afraid get their widows a pension and a folded flag. Wensley pulled away. He stood alone in the open space between the cordon and the house. He raised his hand, signaling the riflemen to hold. Silence fell over the street, thick and suffocating. Even the crowd held its breath. The only sound was the wind whistling through the alleyway and the distant clatter of a hansom cab turning away from the danger. Inside the house, a match struck. The flare of sulfur glowed briefly behind the curtain, then vanished. Smoke began to seep from the window frame, thin and grey, joining the fog. "They're burning it," Thompson whispered. Wensley stood rooted to the spot. He watched the smoke curl into the winter air. The heat from within would grow, pushing the men upstairs, forcing them to the window or the roof. There was no escape. The city surrounded them, a brick ocean closing in. "Let them burn," Wensley said. He turned to the arriving officer in charge of the rifles, commanding him to target the windows and take any head that appeared. Yet he added a crucial restraint: do not fire into the walls, for they did not know who else might be hiding inside. "Understood, sir." Wensley stepped back behind the water cart. The cold was seeping into his bones now, the surge of fear fading to leave a deep, hollow ache. He thought of Tucker, of Bentley. They had died in a yard, in the dark, without witnesses. Here, the whole world watched. The difference offered no comfort. A camera flash popped from the crowd. A photographer had smuggled a tripod past the line. The magnesium flare blinded Wensley for a second, leaving purple spots dancing in his vision. "Smash it," Thompson ordered. "No," Wensley rubbed his eyes. "Let them take it. Let them see what the cost looks like." He leaned against the cart, the wood cold through his coat. The smoke from the window thickened, blackening the lace curtains. Inside, Gardstein and Sokoloff were making their choice. Outside, the machinery of the law waited to collect the remains. The siege had begun in earnest, and the street held its breath, waiting for the fire to speak. Smoke billowed from the sash window, a thick, oily plume that curled against the brickwork before dissolving into the grey morning. It smelled of burnt wool and something sweeter, like roasting meat, though no one spoke the comparison aloud. Wensley kept his head low behind the water cart, the wood damp beneath his palms. A crack split the air sharp, distinct from the rumble of the crowd. Brick dust sprayed Wensley's cheek. He did not flinch. To flinch was to show fear, and the men behind him were watching. Another shot followed, higher this time, shattering the glass of a neighboring tenement. The anarchists were not firing wildly. They were testing ranges, calibrating. "Keep down," Thompson shouted. He crouched beside the cart, his injured arm hanging limp at his side. The cloth around his bicep was already darkening with fresh blood. "They're picking the gaps. Don't give them an inch." Wensley peered over the rim of the cart. The window was a dark square now, the lace curtains gone, consumed by the heat within. Behind the glass, a shadow moved. A shoulder, the glint of a barrel. "Mauser," Wensley said. "They're using the Mausers." "Better than our Webleys," Thompson muttered. He shifted his weight, wincing as his boots scraped the cobbles. "Range is against us. They're high ground. We're in the open." A constable near the gas lamp jerked backward as if pulled by a wire. He dropped his rifle, the wood clattering on the stone. No one moved to help him. To move was to die. The man lay still, his breath hitching in a wet rattle that was quickly swallowed by the noise of the street. "Return fire," Wensley ordered. His voice sounded thin against the backdrop of the crowd's murmur. The police rifles barked. A dozen shots hammered the facade of 100 Sydney Street. Plaster chipped away in white clouds. The brickwork pocked and scarred, but the shadow in the window did not retreat. It dipped, vanished, then reappeared at the adjacent pane. "They're moving," Wensley said, "inside the room." "Flanking," Thompson said. He spat on the ground. The saliva hit the dust and vanished. "They know the layout. They've been planning this since Houndsditch, maybe longer." Wensley watched the second window. The glass vibrated with the impact of a bullet from the outside, a spiderweb fracture spreading from the center, but it held. Inside, the fire was finding purchase. The smoke turned from gray to black, thickening the air until it strung the eyes. The heat radiated from the house, a physical wave that pushed against the cold January wind. It was a fortress, not of stone and mortar, but of desperation, for Gardstein and Sokolov were not hiding, they were holding ground. Every shot they fired was a statement, a refusal to be taken alive by the state that had hunted them across the city. Wensley felt a strange, cold respect settle in his gut. These men would die here, having chosen the manner of it. "Stop firing," Wensley said. The rifles ceased. The sudden quiet was heavier than the noise. The crowd leaned forward, sensing the shift. Even the pressman with the notebook had stopped scratching. "Why?" Thompson asked. He kept his eyes on the window. "We are wasting ammunition, and we're lighting up their position for them." Wensley wiped the brick dust from his face. It mixed with the sweat on his brow. "They want us to shoot. They want the spectacle. So we wait. We wait." A bottle smashed inside the house, its sound dull and muffled by the walls, until a flare of orange light bloomed behind the black smoke. The fire had found the curtains, or perhaps the floorboards, or even the correspondence hidden beneath them. "They're burning it," Thompson said. His voice was flat. "They're burning the evidence." "Let them." Wensley stood up. He knew it was foolish. He knew Thompson would try to pull him down again. He did it anyway. He needed to see. He needed to understand the geometry of their end. "Frederick, get down." Thompson grabbed his coat tail. Wensley shook him off. He stood in the center of the road, exposed to the windows and the crowd and the history that was being written in real time. The heat from the house pressed against his chest. The smoke drifted over him, coating his tongue with the taste of ash and coal. From the window, the shadow raised the pistol again. Wensley saw the movement, the deliberate aim, yet he remained rooted to the spot, his muscles locked in a paralysis of sheer terror. The shot rang out. It missed, high and left, a warning or a mistake. "They're tired," Wensley said. He stepped back behind the cart as the police rifles lifted again. "Hold fire. Do not shoot unless they show themselves fully." "They're going to burn," Thompson said. He was watching the smoke pour from the roof now. The tiles were beginning to slip, sliding down the slope with a clatter that sounded like bones breaking. "There's no way out." "No." Wensley looked at the crowd, where faces pressed together, pale and eager. They wanted blood. They wanted justice. They wanted the story to end with a villain dead on the floor. "But they won't surrender, not for us, not for the law." A cheer went up from the back of the crowd. Someone had spotted movement on the roof, a figure silhouetted against the sky. "Target acquired," a constable shouted. "Wait," Wensley snapped. The figure raised an arm, not in surrender, in defiance. A pistol glinted in the weak sunlight. "He's going to shoot," Thompson said. He lifted his own revolver, hand steady despite the wound. "No." Wensley put a hand on Thompson's arm. "Let him." The shot from the roof cracked into the air, going wide into the sky as a final gesture before the figure dropped from view, disappearing into the inferno below. The fire roared. The sound was immense, a living thing tearing through the timber of the house. The windows blew out, shards of glass raining onto the pavement like hail. The heat intensified, forcing the cordon back a step. "It's done," Thompson said. He lowered his gun. "They're dead." "Not yet." Wensley watched the flames lick the roof timbers. The structure groaned, settling into its own destruction. "We need to be sure, and we need to keep the crowd back. If that wall comes down, it takes half the street with it." "The heavy section." "They'll be here soon." Wensley turned away from the house. He looked at the line of constables, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes wide. They had done their job. They had contained the threat, but the victory felt hollow, like catching a ghost in a net. "Get the fire brigade closer," Wensley said, "but tell them to wait for my signal. I don't want water on that fire until I know there's nothing left to save." "Nothing left to save?" Thompson frowned, his gaze fixed on the inferno. "They're burning, Frederick." He shook his head as the flames roared higher. "There's nothing left." "There's always something." Wensley touched the pocket of his coat. The notebook was there, the names, the connections, the things that Gardstein had died to protect. "The fire hides many things. I intend to see what survives it." He walked towards the edge of the cordon. The pressman was waiting, pencil poised. "Inspector," the man said, "can you confirm the identities?" Wensley stopped. He looked at the burning house. The smoke was choking the sky now, blotting out the sun. "Confirm nothing," Wensley said. "Write that the law was upheld. Write that the danger is past. Leave the rest to the coroner." He pushed past the man, moving towards the command post where the telegraph wire waited. The heavy section would bring the guns that could level the street. Churchill would bring the spectacle, but Wensley knew the truth. The anarchists had won the only victory that mattered. They had chosen their end. Now the city had to live with the smoke. The exhaust from the Daimler hung heavy, a yellow-grey veil that tasted of unburnt petrol and arrogance, clinging to the wool of Wensley's coat long after the motor car had rattled away towards Aldgate. He remained rooted to the spot. Behind him, the timber of number 100 groaned, a deep structural complaint as the fire ate through the joists supporting the top floor, shifting the weight of the brickwork inch by inch towards the street. Smoke billowed from the sash windows in thick, oily rolls, obscuring the glass until the facade looked like a charcoal sketch rubbed by a dirty thumb. "So?" Thompson stood 3 paces back, cap pulled low against the falling ash, his face streaked with soot that made the whites of his eyes appear unnaturally bright. He held a Webley in one hand, the barrel pointing safely at the ground, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the stock. Wensley turned slowly. The heat from the burning house pressed against his back, drying the sweat that had collected along his spine during the argument with Churchill, while the January wind bit at his cheeks, creating a sharp, stinging contrast that made his skin feel tight and brittle. "Clear the neighbors," Wensley said. His voice lacked the resonance it usually carried on the parade ground, sounding thin and frayed against the crackle of the flames. "Every soul in 98 and 99. Get them out before the guns arrive." Thompson hesitated, shifting his weight on the slick cobbles. "The artillery, sir. You mean to use the cannon?" "I mean to do what I am told." Wensley stepped closer, lowering his voice so the constables huddled near the water cart could not hear the tremor of resignation beneath the order. "Churchill wants a conclusion before dusk. He believes 10-pounders will encourage a surrender." "There's no surrender in a firestorm, Frederick." Thompson used the Christian name without thinking, a slip born of exhaustion and the shared memory of Tucker's body cooling in the mortuary. "If we shell the wall, the whole terrace comes down. There are families in those back rooms who haven't seen a policeman since the trouble started, let alone a soldier." "Then make sure they are not there." Wensley grabbed Thompson's arm, the wool of the sergeant's coat rough and damp under his fingers. 10 minutes. That is all the time we have before the Royal Horse Artillery turns this street into a crater. Move." Thompson nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, before turning to bark orders at the line of constables. They scrambled into action, boots slipping on the wet stones as they rushed towards the adjacent doors, hammering on wood that was already beginning to warp from the intense, radiating heat. Wensley watched them go, feeling the familiar, hollow ache in his stomach that had been his constant companion since the first shot was fired in Houndsditch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his notebook, the leather cover warm from his body heat, and flipped it open to a blank page. The pencil hovered over the paper, the lead tip trembling slightly as he tried to formulate a sentence that would justify what was about to happen. 15:40 hours. Home Secretary departs. Order given for artillery deployment. Evacuation of adjacent properties underway. He stopped. The words looked sterile, inadequate to capture the sheer violence of collapsing a house upon the heads of men who had chosen death over surrender. He closed the book and shoved it back into his pocket, the action final and decisive. A shout erupted from the burning building. Wensley snapped his head up, his hand instinctively going to the revolver at his hip. Through the broken pane of the first-floor window, a figure emerged, silhouetted against the orange glow of the inferno behind him. It was Sokolov. The young anarchist leaned out, disregarding the snipers positioned on the rooftops opposite, his arms spread wide as if embracing the smoke that choked the sky. "The state burns," Sokolov's voice carried clearly over the din of the crowd, high and piercing, fueled by a fanaticism that seemed immune to the physical reality of the fire. You can kill the body, but the idea is in the air you breathe. It is in the coal dust. It is in the blood of your own children. A constable near the water cart raised his rifle, taking aim with a steady hand, but Wensley shook his head sharply. "Hold fire," he called out, though he knew the command was futile against the tension that crackled in the air like static electricity. "Let him speak." "He's giving them a target, sir," a young constable muttered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "He is giving us a show," Wensley corrected, "and that is what they want, a martyrdom." Sokolov laughed, a harsh, coughing sound that turned into a wheeze as he inhaled the thick, acrid smoke. He gestured wildly towards the gathered crowd, the people of Stepney who stood shoulder to shoulder behind the police cordon, their faces upturned in a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. "Look at them," Sokolov screamed, his voice breaking. "They watch you kill us because they know you will kill them next. We are the same, the brick and the breath, we are the same." A shot rang out from the rooftop opposite, a Mauser pistol this time, fired from within the room. The bullet sparked off the iron railing inches from Sokolov's head, forcing him back into the shadows of the room. The exchange was brief, sporadic, a final punctuation mark in a sentence that had been written days ago in the blood of 3 constables. Silence returned, heavier than before. Wensley checked his pocket watch. The hands crept towards the hour. 8 minutes remained. He walked over to the water cart, the wheels of which had sunk slightly into the mud churned up by the crowd and the heavy boots of the police. He dipped his hand into the trough, the water freezing and gritty with dirt, and splashed it onto his face. The cold shocked his system, clearing the fog of exhaustion from his mind for a brief, sharp moment. "Sir," Thompson returned, breathless, his tunic unbuttoned at the collar. "99 is clear, 98 is stubborn. An old woman refuses to leave her cat." "Carry her out if you must," Wensley said, wiping his face with a handkerchief that came away black with soot. "But do not let her be there when the first shell lands." "And the men inside?" Thompson asked, nodding towards the burning window where Gardstein was presumably still hiding, perhaps tending to a wound, perhaps loading his final magazine. "Do we offer them one last chance? A megaphone? Something?" Wensley looked at the house. The flames were licking through the roof now, devouring the slate tiles, sending showers of sparks up into the grey sky where they vanished like dying stars. He thought of Churchill's words about necessary casualties, about the machine of state requiring fuel. He thought of Tucker and Bentley and the way the blood had looked on the cobbles, dark and viscous in the weak winter light. "No," Wensley said, "they made their choice when they opened fire in the alley. They wanted a war. Let them have it." A rumble began to vibrate through the ground, a low, rhythmic thudding that was distinct from the crackle of the fire or the murmur of the crowd. It was the sound of heavy wheels on cobblestones, the approach of the guns. Thompson heard it too. He straightened his tunic, his expression hardening into a mask of professional detachment that Wensley recognized as a defense mechanism against the horror of what was coming. "Positions, then," Thompson said. "Positions," Wensley agreed. He walked back to the center of the street, standing alone in the space between the police line and the burning building. The heat was intense now, forcing him to squint against the glare. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, hundreds of strangers judging him, waiting to see if he would flinch when the artillery opened fire. He would not flinch. He adjusted his grip on his revolver, the metal cold and reassuring against his palm, and waited for the Royal Horse Artillery to turn the brick and the breath into ash. The first gun carriage turned the corner, horses steaming in the cold air, the long barrel of the cannon elevated and aimed directly at the heart of the fire. There was no turning back. The horses snorted, plumes of white steam erupting from their nostrils to mingle with the coal smoke haze that clung low over Sydney Street. They were massive creatures, draped in leather harnesses that creaked under the strain of the heavy load dragging behind them, a 13-pounder field gun that looked absurdly out of place among the terraced slums of Stepney. Wensley remained rooted, as the carriage rattled past, the iron-rimmed wheels biting deep into the frozen mud and sending shards of muck flying against his trousers. He watched the crew dismount with practiced efficiency, their red tunics bright and shocking against the grey monotony of the morning, like fresh wounds opened on a dull sky. "Make way," a sergeant barked, shoving a bystander back with the flat of his hand. "Clear the street or be damned with the rest of them." The crowd surged, a single organism pressed tight against the police cordon, hungry for the spectacle they had been denied in the quiet alleys of Houndsditch. They wanted blood, or perhaps just the sound of something breaking that was bigger than their own cramped lives. Wensley turned as a black motor car, sputtering and coughing exhaust fumes that smelled of unburnt petrol, forced its way through the gap the artillery had carved. The door flew open before the engine had fully cut, and Winston Churchill stepped out onto the pavement. He wore a dark overcoat with an astrakhan collar and a top hat, untouched by the soot that coated every other soul in the street. His face was flushed, not from the cold, but from a feverish energy that seemed to vibrate off him in waves. "Inspector," Churchill said, striding forward without offering a hand, "you have taken too long." "The fire is doing the work, Mr. Churchill," Wensley replied, keeping his voice level, though the exhaustion in his bones threatened to drag the words down into a mumble. "The roof has collapsed in the rear. There is no exit." "There is no guarantee they are dead until the walls fall down," Churchill snapped, pulling a cigar from his pocket and biting the end off with a sharp crunch of tobacco. He spat the fragment into the gutter. "And there is no guarantee they will not take a hostage if we wait for the timber to rot. The empire cannot be seen to dither while two foreigners hold a street to ransom." "They are not holding the street, sir. They are burning inside it." "Semantics." Churchill waved a gloved hand towards the house, where the flames were now roaring with a sound like a passing train, consuming the dry joists and floorboards with greedy speed. "The public sees a siege. The papers see a standoff. If we do not act decisively, the narrative shifts. We look weak. We look afraid." Wensley felt the heat on his face, a dry, baking warmth that made his eyes water. He thought of Tucker's widow, sitting in a kitchen that would never feel warm again, and wondered what narrative she cared about. "A frontal assault risks bringing the whole terrace down," Wensley said, stepping slightly into Churchill's path, a small, physical barrier against the man's momentum. 98 and 96 share party walls. If the fire spreads, we kill families who have done nothing but sleep in their beds. "Then let them move," Churchill said, his eyes fixed on the burning window where Gardstein was rumored to be waiting. "War is not tidy, Inspector. You of all people should know that by now. I am a policeman, not a general. Today you are both." Churchill turned to the artillery sergeant, who stood waiting with a ramrod in his hand. "Sergeant, hold the fire brigade, let it burn." "Sir," Wensley started, but the words died in his throat. The sergeant nodded, cap pulled low against the glare. "Aye, sir, the brigade is held back." "Do it," Churchill commanded. The order rippled through the line of men, a sudden tightening of muscles, a shift in breathing. The gun crew stood by their piece, a silent threat amidst the screaming chaos of a city street. They did not load, they did not aim, they merely waited as the house consumed itself. Wensley stood still, his hands clenched at his sides. He could feel the weight of his revolver against his hip, a useless toy against the machinery of state that Churchill had summoned. This was no longer police work, it was sacrifice. "Step back, Frederick," Thompson whispered, appearing at his elbow. The detective sergeant's face was pale, streaked with grime. "Best not to be when the roof goes." "I am not going anywhere," Wensley said. "I need to see it." "You don't need to see men burned alive," Thompson muttered, though his boots remained nailed to the spot. "It's not right, letting them cook in there." "It is what he wants," Wensley said, nodding towards the car where Churchill stood, lighting his cigar with a match that flared bright yellow in the gloom. "He needs the fire to be loud. He needs the world to hear it." A shout came from the window again, weaker this time, rasping through the smoke. "Murderers!" Sokolov's voice was a thread of sound, barely audible over the crackle of the timbers. You burn us because you fear the truth. The fire cleanses. Fire cleanses nothing, Wensley said to the air. It only eats. The house groaned, a deep structural lament that vibrated through the cob. The smoke curled from the upper windows with a sound like the world tearing open, a violent rip that swallowed the gasps of the crowd and the cheer of the spectators before they could fully form in their throats. Bricks, timber, and a century of accumulated soot erupted into the grey January air, not from any impact, but from the greedy, suffocating grip of the fire within, raining down upon the pavement with the heavy, wet thud of breaking bones. The black lungs of the blaze rolled out in great clouds that choked the narrow street and turned the midday light into a bruised twilight. Inside the ruin, the heat was no longer a promise, but a physical presence, pressing against the skin, seizing the air from the lungs. William Sokoloff coughed, a ragged, tearing sound that brought up phlegm tasting of iron and burnt wool. He wiped his mouth with the back of a hand that trembled not from fear, but from the sheer vibration of the collapsing floors still ringing in his marrow. Beside him, Gardstein leaned against the remaining fragment of the chimney breast, his face a mask of grey ash, eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at the hole where the ceiling had been seconds before. The daylight sliced through the smoke, a harsh, intruding beam that illuminated the dancing motes of dust and the glitter of shattered glass on the floorboards. "No way out," Gardstein said, his voice stripped of its usual cadence, reduced to a dry scrape. "The stairs are gone." "The stairs were never the way out," Sokoloff replied, shifting his weight as a beam above them groaned, a low complaint of timber giving up the ghost. "They think we hide in corners. They think we scurry like rats." He looked down at the Mauser in his hand, the metal warm from his grip, the barrel stained with the residue of their defense. It felt lighter now, or perhaps his arms were simply failing, the muscles turning to water under the assault of the heat. Outside, the roar of the crowd swelled again, a distant ocean crashing against the shores of their destruction, eager to witness the end of the spectacle Churchill had orchestrated, while the great gun of the Royal Horse Artillery stood silent in the street, its crew watching the flames do the work of war. "They want a corpse," Sokoloff said, turning to face his comrade, finding a strange clarity in the encroaching flames that licked at the hem of his coat. "Let us give them one they cannot forget. Let the fire be the signature." Gardstein nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. He raised his own pistol, aiming it not at the enemy, but at the ceiling, at the sky, at the indifferent god of the anarchists who had abandoned them in this frozen city. "Better the fire than the hangman's noose," he muttered. "Better to burn than to bend." The roof gave way then, not with a crash of masonry, but with a sigh, a sudden collapse of support that sent a cascade of burning timbers crashing down between them and the street, sealing their chamber in a tomb of orange and red. The heat intensified, a physical blow that knocked Sokoloff back a step, his boots sliding on the slick, wet floorboards. He did not flinch. He merely adjusted his stance, planting his feet firmly on the ground that was rapidly becoming his pyre. Outside, Wensley stood rooted to the spot, the billowing smoke having pushed the air from his own lungs, leaving him gasping like a fish on the dockside. His face was illuminated by the sudden, violent bloom of the fire, the orange glow casting deep, dancing shadows across the sharp lines of his cheekbones and the furrows of his brow. He felt the heat on his skin, a prickling discomfort that warned of the danger, yet he could not make himself step back from the line. The sight of the collapsing roof, the final surrender of the structure to the elements, triggered a profound sadness in him, a heavy, leaden weight that settled in his stomach. Nearby, in his top hat and astrakhan-collared coat, Churchill watched the brigade held at bay, agreeing that the house must be left to burn. It was a waste, not of property nor of police resources, but of life itself, of the bright, fierce intelligence that had driven these men to such a desperate, fiery end. He thought of Tucker and Bentley, their cold bodies in the mortuary, and then of the two men burning inside the house, their lives extinguishing in a roar of flame that served no purpose other than to satisfy the hunger of the headlines. The futility of it all pressed against him, a suffocating pressure that matched the smoke choking the street. "Steady," Thompson shouted, his voice barely audible over the crackling inferno. "Keep the line, don't let anyone get close." Silence stretched from Wensley as he watched the flames dance, seeing in their erratic movements the final struggles of Gardstein and Sokoloff. He imagined them standing together, backs to the wall, refusing to yield an inch to the state that hunted them, choosing death on their own terms rather than the humiliation of surrender. It was a terrible dignity, one that commanded a reluctant respect even as it horrified him. The heat washed over the police line, a tangible wave that forced the officers to shield their faces and step back from the inferno. The cobblestones beneath their feet grew hot, radiating the energy of the destruction upwards through the soles of their boots. Sparks flew high into the sky, joining the falling snow in a chaotic ballet of light and dark, a final, frantic celebration before the silence reclaimed the street. And then, with a final, thunderous roar, the rest of the structure gave way. The walls folded inward, collapsing into the heart of the fire, sending up a massive plume of sparks and ash that obscured the sun entirely. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of breaking brick and splintering wood that shook the ground beneath Wensley's feet, vibrating through his legs and into his chest. No shell had struck the front, yet it fell all the same, drawn into the void by the consuming hunger of the blaze. When the dust began to settle, the house was gone. In its place stood a jagged skeleton of blackened beams, a monument to the violence that had consumed it. The fire still raged within the ruins, but the fury had diminished, reduced to a sullen, crackling glow that pulsed in the darkness like a dying heart. Silence returned, heavy and absolute, broken only by the hiss of water hitting hot stone and the low murmur of the crowd as they realized the spectacle was over. Wensley stood amidst the aftermath, the smoke stinging his eyes, the taste of ash coating his tongue. He looked at the ruin, then at Thompson, whose face was grimed with soot and exhaustion. "It's done," Thompson said, his voice flat, devoid of triumph. Wensley nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He turned away from the burning house, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the uniform, the badge, the responsibility. The fire had decided everything, just as he knew it would. But as he walked back towards the waiting cars, leaving the ruins to the firemen and the coroner, he knew the silence would not last. The breath remained, even if the brick had fallen. And somewhere in the soot-choked alleyways, where the fog clung like a shroud, the next chapter was already being written in ink and blood. The smoke began to curl from the upper windows, a grey, oily serpent that swallowed the lower panes whole before the true heat arrived, a dull, wet thrum that vibrated in the soles of every boot on the pavement. Then the cheer went up from the crowd behind the cordon, a ragged, hungry roar that sounded less like patriotism and more like the baying of hounds catching scent. Nearby, the great 13-pounder field gun of the Royal Horse Artillery stood silent in the street, its crew waiting for an order that would never come. The weapon was positioned, sighted, and ready, yet it remained mute, for the house had already begun to die from within. Inside, the air turned solid. Sokolov coughed, a dry, hacking spasms that tore at his throat, tasting the sulfur and the wet rot of burning lath and plaster. The room had shrunk. Walls that moments ago had offered cover now leaned in, glowing a malevolent cherry red at the edges where the fire had found purchase in the dry timber of the floor joists. Smoke hung low, a thick, oily blanket that forced them to their knees, scraping raw skin against the grit-covered boards. "No door," Gardstein said. His voice was a ruin, stripped of the cadence that had once rallied men in Riga courtyards. He pointed a pistol at the hallway, though the hallway was now a chimney, a funnel drawing the heat upward with a suction that pulled at their coats. "They have the street, they have the roof." Sokolov wiped his eyes with a sleeve already blackened by soot. He could feel the heat radiating through the leather of his boots, a creeping burn that warned of the timber beneath beginning to char. Escape was a math problem with no solution. The windows were iron-barred or too high, and the street below teemed with the blue uniforms of the city police and the darker, heavier shapes of the Scots Guards. "We do not go to them," Sokolov said. He shifted his weight, his Mauser heavy in a hand that trembled not from fear, but from the sheer physical exertion of breathing air that contained less oxygen than flame. "We stay, we make the end ours." Gardstein looked at him, eyes wide and white in the gloom, reflecting the dancing orange light that licked up the wallpaper. There was no panic in that gaze, only a terrible, crystalline acceptance. He nodded, a single sharp dip of the chin. "Better the fire," Gardstein whispered, the words barely audible over the crackle of the drying paint blistering on the walls. Then the rope. Outside, Wensley flinched as the first major beam gave way. The crash was immense, a structural sigh that turned into a roar, sending a geyser of sparks punching through the roof tiles and scattering into the night sky like inverted stars. The heat hit the police line a second later, a physical wall that forced even the stoic Thompson to raise an arm across his face. "Back," Wensley shouted, though the word was snatched away by the updraft. "Give it room." He did not move back himself. He stood planted on the wet cobbles, the cold mud seeping through his shoes, contrasting sharply with the baking wave rolling off the ruin. The orange glow painted his face in stark relief, highlighting the deep lines of exhaustion that ran from his nose to the corners of his mouth, the gray stubble that had grown over the last 12 hours of siege. He watched the roof collapse, the timbers folding inward like the ribs of a great beast expiring, and felt a sudden hollow ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the smoke. Nearby, in his top hat and astrakhan-collared coat, Churchill watched the blaze with steely resolve, agreeing silently that the fire brigade must be held back. The house was to be left to its fate. It was a waste. The word circled his mind, useless and persistent. Not the building. Houses in Stepney were cheap, replaceable, mere bricks stacked on mortar to hold the poor against the winter wind. It was the men. He thought of the 3 constables in the mortuary, their bodies still stiffening, their families waiting for news that would arrive with a knock on the door and a cap in hand. And now these 2, Gardstein and Sokoloff. Men who could have been scholars or fathers or simply neighbors, reduced to shadows in a furnace because they believed the world could be broken and remade by the force of a bullet. "They're gone in there, Fred," Thompson said, stepping close enough that Wensley could smell the sweat and gunpowder on his tunic. Nothing living could survive that heat. Wensley did not answer immediately. He watched a window frame buckle and fall inward, swallowed by the inferno. "They chose it," he said finally, his voice rough. "They knew the fire would bring the roof down. They stayed." "Suicide," Thompson spat, kicking a piece of debris that skittered across the stones. "Madness. We could have taken them alive, questioned them." "Would they have spoken?" Wensley turned to look at his sergeant, his eyes tired, the blue iris almost gray in the firelight. "You know the type, John. They'd have bitten their tongues out before giving us a name. This way they keep their secrets and their dignity." The heat intensified, a rolling wave that forced the entire line to retreat another 5 yards. The cobblestones hissed as water from the hoses, held in check, rarely applied, struck the periphery, turning to instant steam that mingled with the smoke, creating a blinding, choking fog that smelled of wet ash and burnt wool. Sparks rained down, some landing on the wet coats of the officers, sizzling out instantly, others dancing on the wind to vanish in the darkness of the alleyways behind the silent gun. Then came the final collapse. The floors and roof, weakened solely by the ravenous flames, folded inward with a thunderous crash that shook the ground beneath their feet. A massive plume of ash and embers shot upward, obscuring the moon, blotting out the stars, turning the night into a churning vortex of gray and orange. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of breaking brick and splintering wood that seemed to go on forever, vibrating through Wensley's legs and settling deep in his bones. The front wall stood defiant for a moment, untouched by any shell, before it too surrendered to gravity and the fire's hungry mouth. When the dust began to settle, the house was gone. In its place stood a jagged skeleton of blackened beams, a grotesque sculpture against the night sky. The fire still raged within the ruins, but the fury had diminished, reduced to a sullen, crackling glow that pulsed in the darkness like a dying heart. The cheering from the crowd had died away, replaced by a murmur of disappointment, the spectral hunger of the spectators unsated now that the spectacle was concluding. Silence returned, heavy and absolute, broken only by the hiss of water hitting hot stone and the low, rhythmic chanting of the firemen who were finally permitted to dampen the edges. Wensley stood amidst the aftermath, the smoke stinging his eyes, the taste of ash coating his tongue, gritty and dry. He looked at the ruin, then at Thompson, whose face was grimed with soot, his cap askew, his expression one of grim relief mixed with a lingering unease. "It's done," Thompson said, his voice flat, devoid of triumph. He wiped his hands on his trousers, leaving dark smears on the fabric. We can send the coroner in when the coals die. Wensley nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He turned away from the burning house, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the uniform, the badge, the responsibility. The fire had decided everything, just as he knew it would. The anarchists were dead, the threat neutralized, the headlines secured for the Home Secretary. But as he walked back towards the waiting cars, leaving the ruins to the firemen and the coroner, he knew the silence would not last. The breath remained, even if the brick had fallen. "Get the men back to the station," Wensley said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried in the sudden quiet. "And John, make sure the widows are told before the papers print." Thompson paused, his hand on the door of the motor car. He looked at Wensley, really looked at him, seeing the deep furrows of grief that the firelight had exposed. "Aye, Fred, I'll see to it." Wensley climbed into the car, the leather seat cold against his back. He closed his eyes as the engine cranked, shutting out the sight of the glowing ruins, but the image was burned onto the inside of his lids. 2 men in a room, choosing fire over rope, and 3 constables in a cellar, dead for a handful of jewels, and a principal neither side truly understood. The car lurched forward, pulling away from the curb, but the heat of the fire seemed to follow them, a phantom warmth in the freezing London night, promising that the ashes would settle slowly and the accounting would take far longer than the burning. The collapse did not end with a crash, but with a sigh, a long, grinding exhalation of timber giving up its burden as the roof surrendered to gravity and flame. Dust, thick and grey as funeral ash, billowed outward from the ruin, coating the faces of the men who stood watching, settling in the creases of their uniforms and the lines of their exhaustion. Wensley blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the grit only scratched at his eyelids, a physical reminder of the destruction he had overseen. The heat remained, a solid wall pressing against his chest, forcing him to take shallow sips of air that tasted of charred meat and wet plaster. "Step back," someone shouted, though the voice was thin, swallowed by the roar of the dying building. "The front wall's loose." Wensley did not move. He watched the orange tongue of the fire lick at the remaining rafters, consuming the last sanctuary of Gardstein and Sokolov. There was no scream, no final plea for mercy, only the crackle of wood and the hiss of water. It was a clean death, in its way, faster than the gallows, quieter than the bullet that had taken Bentley. He wondered, not for the first time that night, if the 2 men inside had held hands as the beams fell, or if they had spent their final seconds checking the chambers of their Mausers, ensuring they could take one more policeman with them if the floor held. "Fred," Thompson said, his hand gripping Wensley's elbow, the touch firm, grounding. "The wall, move." Wensley allowed himself to be pulled back, his boots scraping against the slick cobbles. The front far A-tilde section, Adair of number 100 groaned, a deep, structural complaint that vibrated through the soles of his feet before tilting inward with a finality that shook the air. A cloud of sparks erupted, swirling upward like angry spirits before vanishing into the low-hanging fog. The street, moments ago a theater of cheers and gunshots, now felt hollow, a stage cleared after a tragedy that had satisfied no one. "God save us," a constable muttered nearby, crossing himself with a gloved hand. "They're cooked through, nothing left but bone." "Don't," Wensley snapped, the word sharp, cutting through the damp air. He turned to the young officer, seeing the wide, shocked eyes beneath the helmet brim. "There are no bodies until the fire brigade says there are bodies. We do not speculate, we do not gawk." The constable flinched, nodding quickly, stepping back into the shadow of a fire engine. Wensley exhaled, the breath shuddering in his lungs. He felt old, older than his years, the weight of the badge on his chest pressing down like a lead ingot. He thought of the letter he would have to write to the Home Office, the sterile language required to describe such visceral ruin. Subjects deceased, premises destroyed, threat neutralized. The words felt like lies. They were not subjects. They were men who had chosen fire over the state, who had looked at the noose and decided on the pyre. Thompson moved to his side again, lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly, the flare of the match illuminating the soot grinning his teeth. "Churchill's gone," he said, blowing smoke into the freezing air. "Slipped away while the roof was coming down, didn't want to be here for the cleanup." "Smart man," Wensley replied, his voice flat. He gets the victory parade, we get the mortuary. He left orders for the cordon to hold until dawn, no one in or out until the coroner sees the remains. Thompson kicked at a piece of burnt timber, sending a shower of embers skittering across the wet stones. Do you think they suffered? Wensley looked at the smouldering skeleton of the house. The flames were lower now, reduced to a sullen glow within the pile of debris, pulsing rhythmically like a failing heart. Smoke would have taken them first, he said, the image unbidden and unwelcome in his mind. Lungs filling with black water, consciousness fading before the heat touched them. I hope so. Thompson dropped the cigarette, crushing it under his heel. Hope so. A fireman approached, his face blackened, his coat steaming in the cold. He stopped a respectful distance from Wensley, pulling a notebook from his pocket. Inspector, we can't guarantee the structure yet. Might be another hour before we can drag the debris, but there's no chance of survival, not in that inferno. Understood, Wensley said. Keep the water on the perimeter. I don't want this spreading to the neighbors. We've had enough death on this street for one night. The fireman nodded, tipping his helmet, and turned back to his men, shouting orders that were crisp and functional, devoid of the philosophical weight that hung over the police line. Wensley watched them work, envying their simplicity. For them, this was just a fire to be put out, a job to be finished. For him, it was the end of a chase that had begun with blood in a cellar and ended with ash in the gutter. 3 constables dead, 2 anarchists dead, and what remained? A pile of bricks, and a city that would wake up tomorrow and read about it in the papers over breakfast, shaking their heads before turning the page. Let's get the statements taken, Wensley said, turning his back on the ruin, before the crowd disperses and the stories start to grow legs. Right you are, Thompson replied, falling into step beside him. I'll start with the boys on the left flank. They had the best view of the window when the shell hit. Wensley walked towards the waiting motor car, the leather seat cold and unforgiving beneath him. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes, but the darkness behind his lids offered no relief. The image of the collapsing roof played on a loop, the shower of sparks, the sudden silence. He thought of Gardstein, the man they had called Peter the Painter, the ghost who had haunted the East End for weeks. Now he was just carbon and memory. Sokolov, too, with his rigid ideals and his young, fierce eyes. Gone. Fred, Thompson's voice came from outside the car, muffled by the glass. You coming back to the station, or do you want to wait for the coroner? Wensley opened his eyes. The fire was still burning, a dull red eye in the darkness of Stepney. It would burn for hours, maybe until dawn, a beacon for every revolutionary and cutthroat in London. A signature written in smoke, just as Sokolov had wanted. I'll wait, Wensley said, his voice rough. I'm not leaving until I know their names are on the tag, real names, not aliases. Suit yourself, Thompson tapped the roof of the car. I'll send a runner with tea when we get back. The engine cranked, sputtering before catching, the vibration humming through the chassis. Wensley watched Thompson walk away, his silhouette merging with the shadows of the other officers. The street was quieting now, the crowd thinning, the spectacle over. Only the fire remained and the men who tended it and the dead who lay within. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his notebook, the pen tucked inside ready for the next entry. But he did not take it out. Not yet. There was nothing to write but the truth, and the truth was too heavy to lift in the middle of the night. He watched a single spark rise from the ruins, drifting upward into the fog, bright and brief, before vanishing completely. The ash did not fall like snow. It clung, a greasy grey film that coated the tongue and settled into the weave of Wensley's greatcoat, smelling of wet charcoal and something sweeter, sicklier, that belonged to burnt hair. He stepped over a length of charred banister, the wood crumbling under his boot heel with a sound like dry bones snapping, and moved deeper into the skeleton of the house. The roof was gone, torn away by the fire and the shells, leaving the interior open to the bruised purple of the dawn sky. A cold draft whipping through the rooms where men had lived and died just hours before. Careful there, Inspector. Thompson's voice came from the doorway, rough with smoke. He stood framed in the blackened arch, holding a lantern that cast long, dancing shadows against walls stripped bare by the heat. Floorboards are rotten beneath the soot. Wouldn't want you taking a tumble into the cellar now the job's done. Wensley paused, balancing on a joist that groaned in protest. I need to see them, John, before they move the bodies, before the coroner's men strip the scene and turn them into evidence tags. They're not going anywhere, Thompson said, stepping carefully onto the same beam, his bulk shifting the balance of the timber. Fire took its due, there's nothing left but the shape of them. The shape is enough. Wensley moved forward, the ash puffing up around his ankles. The room had been a sitting space once. A fragment of floral wallpaper clung to the corner, pristine and absurdly cheerful amidst the devastation, a tiny island of domesticity in a sea of ruin. And there, huddled near where the hearth must have stood, were the remains. They were not monstrous. That was the first thing that struck him, cutting through the exhaustion that fogged his mind. They were small. Shrunken by the fire, curled inward, as if trying to protect something vital from the inferno that had consumed them. Gardsteiner Svars, Piatkow, the ghost with a dozen Namesa lay on his side, one arm thrown out as if reaching for a weapon that had long since melted into the floorboards. His face was obscured by soot, features blurred into a uniform mask of carbon, yet the posture spoke of a final, defiant tension. Beside him, slightly further back, was Sokolov, younger. The fire had been less kind to him, or perhaps he had been closer to the heart of the blaze when the roof gave way. "Do you recognize them?" Thompson asked, his voice low, devoid of curiosity, heavy with a pragmatic reverence. "I recognize the stance," Wensley said, kneeling despite the protest of his knees, the damp cold of the ruins seeping through his trousers. Gardstein always stood with his weight on his back foot. Even in death, he's ready to run. He reached out, then stopped himself, his gloved hand hovering inches from the blackened shoulder. To touch would be to confirm the finality, to make the abstract reality of the siege concrete in a way he wasn't sure he could bear. And Sokolov, he wanted to be seen. Even now, he's facing the door. "I facing the door." Thompson shifted the lantern, the light flickering over the charred forms. "Strange, isn't it? All that noise. The Mausers, the guns from the tower, the cheering of the crowd when the wall came down. And now this, quiet as a churchyard." "The quiet is the lie," Wensley murmured, straightening up, his joints stiff. "The noise is still there, in the heads of the men who fired the shots, in the widows back at Houndsditch. It doesn't stop just because the fire went out." He turned away from the bodies, unable to look any longer at the tragic stillness of men who had chosen death over the cage. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, pressing against his chest. He needed air that didn't taste of death. He needed to be outside, where the world was still turning, where the milk carts were already clattering over the cobbles, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded in this narrow street. As they picked their way back through the debris towards the street, a figure emerged from the gloom near the cordon. Churchill, the Home Secretary, looked immaculate despite the hour, his coat brushed free of the worst of the soot, his cigar unlit but clenched firmly between his teeth. He held a bowler hat in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against his leg. "Inspector," Churchill said, his voice carrying that familiar, brassy confidence that seemed to repel the soot and river fog of White-Capelle. "A decisive conclusion. The public will sleep easier tonight knowing these vermin are extinguished." Wensley stopped, the ash on his boots leaving faint grey prints on the cleaner pavement. He looked at the politician, seeing the calculation behind the eyes, the way the man was already framing the narrative for the morning papers, for the parliament that would convene in a few hours. "They are dead, sir. Whether that makes anyone sleep easier remains to be seen. 3 of my men are still in the mortuary because of this." Churchill's expression tightened, a fleeting crack in the armor of statesmanship. He waved a dismissive hand, the gesture sweeping away the inconvenience of the dead constables. "A regrettable cost of order, Wensley, but order is restored. The Empire cannot be seen to waver. You have done your duty." "My duty," Wensley repeated, the words tasting of ash. "Yes, the duty is done." "See that the report is on my desk by noon," Churchill said, turning on his heel, already moving towards the waiting motor car where a driver held the door open. "The details matter, Inspector. Ensure the narrative reflects the necessity of our actions." He climbed into the car, the door slamming shut with a solid, expensive thud that severed the connection between the politician and the ruin. The engine roared to life, drowning out the distant murmur of the remaining crowd, and the car pulled away, leaving Wensley and Thompson standing in the silence of the street. Thompson spat on the ground, a dark globule landing in the grey dust. "Necessity," he muttered, the word dripping